The yard went silent the moment Argo dropped into his attack stance. 85 pounds of black Belgian Malinois, all compressed muscle and locked jaw, positioned 3 feet from a woman in a gray civilian jacket who had no business being inside a restricted military K9 facility. Every handler within 20 yards stopped breathing. Sergeant Reese Vanner held the slack leash with one hand and crossed the other arm over his chest, already satisfied with what was about to happen. Argo had sent 2 experienced handlers to the medical bay in the last month. A civilian evaluator from some regional oversight board wasn't going to fare better. The woman didn't step back, didn't raise her hands. She looked at the dog the way a person looks at something they already understand completely, quiet, unhurried, like none of this was a surprise. She said 2 words, barely above a whisper. Argo's haunches dropped. His ears went from pinned flat to neutral. He exhaled through his nose and sat. The whole yard stayed frozen for another 3 seconds before anyone moved. Vanner's arm dropped from his chest. He stared at the dog, then at the woman, like she'd done something that violated a law of physics. Nobody in that facility knew her real name yet, not her history, not what she'd built and had taken from her. By the time they figured all of it out, it would be too late to pretend they'd never dismissed her. If this story already has you hooked, I want you to stay with me all the way to the end, because what happens in that yard over the next 4 days is going to change everything you think you know about who gets credit for genius. Hit like, subscribe so you don't lose the next parts, and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Fenna Walgrave had driven 4 hours from Colburn, where she kept an office in a converted machine shop near the freight rail yard, because that was the kind of workspace she could afford on a contract evaluator's salary. She wasn't military. She'd been out for 6 years. She drove a 9-year-old pickup with a cracked dashboard and a passenger seat that permanently smelled like dog because she transported animals for the county shelter on weekends when the work was slow. The contract from the Department of Defense Military Working Dog Program had arrived as a standard oversight request. Joint Base San Antonio was reporting a failure rate of 31% in their active K9 unit over the past 14 months. Dogs being removed from service, flagged as unreliable, or, in 3 cases, scheduled for destruction. The program coordinator in Washington had seen the numbers and gotten nervous. They needed an outside evaluator, someone with behavioral expertise and no ties to the unit's command structure. Fenna had been the 3rd name on the list. The first 2 had declined after learning who ran the unit. She hadn't declined. She knew exactly who ran the unit. That was why she said yes. She pulled through the main gate at Joint Bay at 7:40 in the morning, showed her credentials to a corporal who looked at the paper, looked at her truck, and looked back at the paper with the particular expression of someone doing math that wasn't adding up. She parked in Visitor Lot C, grabbed her field bag, and walked to the K9 operations building without waiting for an escort. The K9 facility sat at the eastern edge of the base, separated from the main compound by a chain-link perimeter and a stand of scrub cedar that blocked the wind off the parade ground. It was utilitarian. The way all military construction was utilitarian: concrete block, corrugated metal roof, the smell of disinfectant and cedar shavings and dog. Fenna had been in 41 facilities like this across 11 states. She knew what a healthy one smelled like and what a stressed one smelled like. This one smelled like stress. The kennels were too loud, not the productive loud of dogs alert and energized. This was the frantic cycling bark of animals that had learned their environment was unpredictable. A shepherd mix at the end of the row was pacing a pattern so worn the concrete showed raw. That dog had been circling the same path for weeks, maybe months. She was still standing outside the kennel row when the side door of the operations building pushed open and Sergeant Reese Vanner walked out. He was a compact man, somewhere in his late 30s, with the posture of someone who'd spent a career making sure people registered his rank before his face. He had a coffee thermos in one hand and a leash coiled over his shoulder, and he looked at Fenna with the specific flatness of someone who'd already made a decision about her. "Walgrave," he said. Not a question. He'd seen her name on the access list. Sergeant Vanner. She didn't extend her hand. Neither did he. "Evaluator's brief is at 0900. You're early." "I wanted to walk the yard first." "The yard's operational. Dogs are in morning rotation." "That's fine," Fenna said. "I'll stay clear of active training." He looked at her field bag, then at her jacket. Civilian gray, no insignia, no unit patch. You ever worked with military working dogs before? Or is this more of a shelter background? The question was designed to land a certain way, and it did. A woman who fostered shelter dogs on weekends, now walking into a high-security K9 facility to tell decorated handlers their program was broken. That was the story Vanner had already written. "I've got the program notes from my office," Fenna said. "I'll bring them to the brief." She walked past him toward the yard. She heard him on his radio 30 seconds later, calling the unit senior NCO. She didn't slow down. The morning training rotation had 8 dogs in the main yard, 4 in drive training, pursuit, apprehension, obstacle, and 4 in what the session sheet called maintenance work, which should have meant calm behavioral reinforcement, reward-based pattern drilling, the kind of low-stress work that kept a high-drive animal balanced. What Fenna saw instead were 4 dogs in elevated states being run through repetitive bite scenarios with escalating handler pressure. That wasn't maintenance. That was aggression stacking, and it explained a lot about those failure numbers. She stood at the fence and watched without taking notes. Notes could wait. Right now she was reading the dogs, and the dogs were telling her something the paperwork hadn't been able to articulate. They weren't broken animals. They were animals who'd been pushed past their recovery threshold so many times that they no longer trusted the down cycle. They'd lost the ability to believe the pressure would ever stop. She was still watching when she heard the kennel gate open behind her and the particular sound of a high-drive dog coming out on a working leash. She turned. Vanner had Argo on a 30-foot tracking lead, but the dog wasn't tracking. He was fixed on Fenna with the flat forward stare of an animal that had decided she was a problem. Argo was a black Belgian Malinois, heavier than most Mals, with a chest scar from a training incident that had never been properly documented in the records she'd received. His drive score was listed as exceptional. His recovery score was listed as unstable. Those two things together meant he was a dog that could be turned on easily and couldn't be brought reliably back down. A liability. A dog that, in a different facility, would already have been evaluated for retirement. He came out for his session, Vanor said. 2 handlers had materialized behind him. 2 more were watching from the operations doorway. Nobody had wandered out here by accident. This was staged. Argo hit the end of his tracking lead and went into a full attack crouch, haunches high, weight forward, the low vibration of a growl that hadn't fully formed yet. 3 feet from Fenna. She held her ground, not because she was performing courage, but because moving was the worst thing she could do, and she knew it. And she'd known it since she was 24 years old and spending 14-hour days inside the military's most dysfunctional K9 program, trying to fix something everyone else had given up on. She looked at Argo. Not at his eyes. You didn't stare into a working dog's eyes. That was theater, not training. But at his posture, his breathing, the tension pattern across his shoulders. She read him the way she would read a paragraph, scanning for meaning. He was not hunting, he was testing. There was a difference, and it was the entire difference between a dog who needed redirection and a dog who needed to be put down, and the people in this yard didn't know how to tell them apart. She lowered her shoulders, dropped her chin about 2 degrees. Not submission, grounding. She breathed out slowly through her nose. "You're all right," she said, quiet, flat. Not baby talk, not a command bark, just a signal that the situation had already been assessed and nothing dangerous was happening. Argo's growl cut off. His haunches settled, his ears shifted from pinned back to neutral in the space of one breath. He sat. The yard was completely silent. Vanner stood with the leash in his hand and an expression Fenna had seen before, not on handlers, but on people who'd just been proven wrong about something they'd been certain of. It was the specific look of someone whose argument had just collapsed and who needed a new one immediately. "Lucky Red," one of the handlers behind him said, just loud enough. "Walk him back," Fenna said without turning around. "He's been in high drive rotation for at least 90 minutes today, and his recovery baseline is already degraded. If you run him through another apprehension scenario right now, you're going to have an incident." Vanner said nothing. "I'll be at the brief at 9, Fenna said, and walked back toward the operations building. The brief room was a converted storage space that smelled like dry erase marker and old coffee. 8 people around a folding table. Vanner, 3 senior handlers, a program administrator named Hollis Greer, who kept checking her phone, and Master Sergeant Del Wickersgill, who had the weathered, careful look of someone who had been in the unit long enough to have seen 3 commanders and had opinions about all of them. Commander Tobin Wieland wasn't in the room. He was listed on the unit roster as program director, and his name appeared on every official training document in the packet Fenna had received, but he was at a base commander's conference in Fort Alden until the following day. Fenna had noted the timing when she accepted the contract. She'd wanted a day in the facility before she had to deal with Wieland. She set her field notes on the table and pulled up the failure data on her laptop. 14 months, she said. 31% program attrition. 3 dogs scheduled for behavioral euthanasia, 17 removed from active service, 6 currently on restricted duty. I want to start with the methodology before we get to individual case files. Hollis Greer looked up from her phone. The methodology is the Wieland method. It's been the unit standard for, I know what it's called, Fenna said. I want to look at how it's being applied. Vanner leaned back in his chair. The method is sound. The issue is dog selection. We've been getting K9 candidates that don't meet the drive threshold. Your drive scores for the dogs currently in service are excellent, Fenna said. Average drive score is 91. That's not a selection problem. That's a recovery problem. The dogs are being pushed through aggression cycles without adequate recovery windows, Fenna said. I watched 4 dogs in the yard this morning running escalating bite scenarios back to back. That's not a maintenance session. That's how you create an animal that can't regulate itself. She pulled up a training log on her screen. Brask, Malian Shepherd, 4 years old, one of the 3 scheduled for euthanasia. The incident report says unprovoked attack on a handler in the North Kennel Corridor 11 days ago. Nobody said anything. I'd like to see his full training record, including his drive and recovery session logs for the 6 weeks prior to the incident. Vanner glanced at Wickersgill. Wickersgill looked at Fenna. Those records are in Commander Wieland's files, Greer said carefully. He'd need to authorize. I have DoD evaluation authority, Fenna said. The authorization letter is in the packet you received last week. I need the training logs by end of day. The room got quiet in the specific way rooms get quiet when everyone is waiting for the senior person to decide how much of a fight they want to have. Wickersgill said, I'll pull them. Vanner looked at him. Wickersgill didn't look back. She spent the rest of the morning in the kennel building, working her way down the rows. Not testing, not evaluating for the official record yet, just being present. Letting the dogs read her the same way she was reading them. In Kennel 14, she found Brask. He was a Malian shepherd, taller than the Malinois, with the kind of bone structure that said he'd been bred for stamina rather than speed. He had a bandage on his left shoulder where the bite incident had occurred, not where Brask had bitten a handler, but where a handler had struck him during what the incident report called a restraint attempt. Fenna had caught that detail in the 3rd paragraph of a 4-page report written to bury it. Brask stood at the back of his kennel with his weight on 3 legs, watching her with the careful, measuring attention of an animal that had learned people could hurt you when you weren't expecting it. She crouched down to his level, didn't reach through the fence, just settled into the same grounding posture she'd used with Argo, shoulders down, weight back, nothing demanding. Hey, she said. He looked at her for a long time. Then he took 2 steps toward the fence. It wasn't trust. Not yet. But it was the absence of terror, which was further than most people in this facility had managed with him in the last 2 weeks. She stayed with him for 20 minutes. When she left, he was lying down near the front of his kennel instead of pressed against the back wall. In the hallway, she ran into Wickersgill. He was a big man, not military barrel chest big, but the kind of big that comes from actual physical work over a long time. He had a folder in one hand that was thicker than it had any right to be. Brask's logs, he said, and handed it to her. She took it, didn't open it yet. You worked with the commander before? He asked. Not accusatory, actually asking. We've had professional overlap, she said. Wickersgill nodded like that told him something. The command that settled Argo this morning, where'd you learn it? She looked at him. He was watching her with the careful patience of someone who'd already guessed the answer and was waiting to see if she'd give him the honest one. I wrote it, she said. He was quiet for a moment. The Wieland method. That's what it's being called. He looked at the folder she was holding. Then he looked at her. The original documentation, he said. For the 4-stage system. You'd need something dated. Yes, she said. I would. He held her gaze for another 3 seconds, then nodded once and walked back down the corridor. That evening, Fenna spread Brask's session logs across the desk in the temporary office Greer had assigned her, a windowless room off the admin corridor with a broken overhead light she fixed by unscrewing the loose tube and reseating it herself. She made coffee in the break room and brought it back and sat with the logs for 2 hours. What she found was not surprising. It was just ugly. The 4-stage drive-in recovery system she had developed, the one that required alternating high-intensity drive phases with deliberate, structured recovery periods, the one that gave a working dog the neurological ability to downregulate after extreme activation, had been applied to Brask's training at stages 1, 2, and 3. Stage 4 was missing entirely. Stage 4 was the integration phase. It was the part where everything the dog had learned about trust and regulation got anchored into the relationship with his handler. Without it, the first 3 stages didn't hold. Without it, a high-drive dog would eventually reach a point where the activation had no off-ramp. Brask's session logs showed 17 consecutive sessions over 6 weeks, stages 1 through 3, cycling, no stage 4. Pushing the drive higher each time, never letting it come down clean. The unprovoked attack had happened in session 18. It wasn't unprovoked. It was inevitable. Fenna set down the last log and pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes for a moment. She wasn't surprised. She was tired in the specific way you get tired when you see something preventable that was not prevented, and you have to sit with the knowledge that a dog was going to be destroyed for a training failure that had a human name on it. She pulled her field bag from under the desk and found the inner zipper pocket where she kept documents she didn't trust to digital storage. She'd driven 4 hours with a folder inside that bag. She'd been carrying the same folder for 3 years, moving it from office to office, keeping it as carefully as other people kept financial records or legal documents. Inside, 11 pages of handwritten notes, dated 6 years ago, from a 12-month development process she'd conducted during her last deployment assignment before her medical discharge. Notes in her own handwriting, timestamps, cross-references to training trials she'd run at a facility in Hessler, where the unit commander had given her access to their K9 program after their trainer retired unexpectedly. The 4-stage system, in her handwriting, dated 14 months before Commander Tobin Veland had presented it to the military working dog program as his own development. She set the folder on the desk next to Brask's session logs and looked at both of them. The stolen method, the destroyed dog, both in front of her at the same time. She closed the folder and put it back in the bag. Tomorrow, Veland would be back on base. She had one more day to understand this facility completely before that door opened. She wasn't going to waste it. She was back in the yard at 0600 the following morning, before most of the handlers had arrived. The morning was cold for the season, a front having pushed through overnight, and her breath made small clouds as she walked the perimeter. Wickersgill was already there, sitting on the training platform with a cup of coffee and the particular stillness of someone who either meditated or just didn't move much when he didn't have to. He watched her walk the fence line without comment. When she got back around to where he was sitting, she stopped. "How long has the stage 4 dropout been happening?" she asked. He didn't ask her what she meant. "Since Veland centralized the training design authority. About 18 months ago." He turned the cup in his hands. "I flagged it twice. Was told the method had been updated. Updated to remove the stabilization phase. That's what I was told. And you kept flagging it." "And I kept getting told the method was current." He looked at her. 3 dogs are scheduled to die because the method is current." She said nothing. "If you've got documents," he said carefully, "the timeline matters. It matters a lot." "I know." She walked toward the kennel building. She needed to see Brask before the day got loud. He was at the front of his kennel when she arrived, standing with his weight on all 4 legs, watching the corridor with his ears up. He saw her come through the door and held her gaze steadily. Not the careful measuring look from yesterday, something more direct. She stopped at his kennel and crouched down. He walked to the fence, pressed his nose briefly through the chain link. She touched the back of her hand to the fence, one knuckle against his nose, and let him smell her. He exhaled, not calm exactly. This dog hadn't been calm in weeks, but quieter, less braced. "I've got you," she said. "Not performance, just the truth." The kennel building's main door opened at the far end of the corridor, and she heard multiple sets of boots on the concrete, the morning handler rotation arriving. She stood up and turned to go get more coffee and lay out her evaluation plan for the day. The door at the near end of the corridor opened instead. Commander Tobin Wieland walked in. He was taller than she'd expected. They'd never met in person, only through correspondence and one conference call 3 years ago when she'd first tried to raise the credit issue through proper channels and been routed to a form letter. He had the pressed uniform composure of someone who operated from certainty and wasn't accustomed to having it questioned. He stopped when he saw her. She watched his face go through a rapid internal calculation, recognition, surprise, and then something that was not quite confidence but was performing it very hard. "Walgrave," he said. "Thought you weren't getting here until—" "I arrived yesterday," she said. "Standard field evaluation protocol." "Right." He looked at the kennel corridor around her, recalibrating. "I got briefed on the Argo situation yesterday morning. Impressive. He's a manageable dog. He needs his recovery protocol restored." "Our recovery protocol is not being applied past stage 3, she said. "I've reviewed 14 months of session logs." The integration phase was removed from the program design. The composure he was maintaining took visible effort for 1 second. The method was refined. Stage 4 was integrated differently. The Stage 4 material doesn't appear in any of the current training documentation. "That's a documentation gap," he said, "not a methodology gap." "I have 3 dogs scheduled for euthanasia because they weren't given the integration phase," Fenna said. "I'd like to know where it went." Wieland's expression settled into something controlled and unhelpful. "I'll have my documentation team pull the updated materials. We can sit down this afternoon and go through—" "I'll need the original design documents," she said. "The development records for the 4-stage system, including authorship documentation and date stamps." He was quiet for exactly 1 second too long. "That's in the program archive," he said. "Might take a day or 2. "I've got a kernel site inspection in 48 hours, Fenna said. "I'll need the documentation before then." She walked past him toward the operations building. Behind her, she heard Brask shift in his kennel. She didn't look back. She was still in the corridor when she heard Wieland pull out his phone and start talking in a low voice, and she kept walking because there was nothing he could say into that phone that would change what was already in her field bag. The documents were dated. The handwriting was hers. The dogs were in front of her. Whatever he was arranging for the next 48 hours, she was going to be ready for it, because she had not driven 4 hours and waited 3 years to walk away from a facility where a dog was scheduled to die for a lie that had her name on the back of it. She pushed through the operations door into the cold morning air and stood for a moment in the yard, where Argo was just being brought out for his morning session by a handler who didn't know yet that everything about to happen in this facility was going to be different. The handler clipped the long lead and released Argo into the training yard. The dog ran 3 full laps of the fence line, burning energy, before he stopped on the far side and looked at Fenna across 40 yards of open ground. He held her gaze for a moment. Then his tail moved once. She turned and went inside to work. She went inside to work, and the work was the kind that didn't announce itself. No dramatic reveal, no confrontation in a hallway, just a woman at a desk pulling files and reading until her eyes hurt and the coffee went cold. The documentation request she'd submitted the evening before had generated a response overnight. A single email from Wieland's administrative assistant, a specialist named Prout, who informed her with careful bureaucratic courtesy that the program's original design archive was stored in a central records facility in Fort Alden and would require a formal retrieval request with a processing window of 5 to 7 business days. 5 to 7 business days. The colonel's inspection was in 46 hours. Fenna read the email twice, then closed her laptop and opened Brask's session folder again. She wasn't going to get the documents through official channels. She'd known that before she submitted the request. The request was on record now, time-stamped, which was the point. She needed a paper trail that showed she'd asked and been delayed. That delay was itself a data point. What she actually needed was already in the facility. She just had to find it. Military K9 programs generated paper, the way old buildings generated dust, constantly, in every crevice, because every training session required a handler log. Every handler log required a supervisor sign-off, and every sign-off created a carbon copy that went somewhere. The digital records were clean and curated and, she suspected, had been selectively edited in the last 18 months. But paper carbons didn't get edited. They got filed and forgotten, and in a facility that had been running the same kennel operation for 11 years. Forgotten meant stacked in filing cabinets in the back of the supply room because nobody had gotten around to scanning them. She found Wicker's Gill at the training equipment cage at OH730, inventorying bite sleeves. The supply room, she said, carbon session logs. How far back do they go? He considered this with the measured pace of a man who didn't spend words carelessly. Program's been here since '09, might have paper going back that far. Nobody's touched it since the digital system came in. Who has access? Anyone with a base ID and a reason. He looked at her. Supply Sergeant's Mendek. She's in at 0800. Thank you, Fenna said. He went back to the bite sleeves. She went to find Mendek. Supply Sergeant Ira Mendek was a small, precise woman who ran her storage room the way some people ran kitchens. Everything had a place, the place was labeled, and anyone who moved something without putting it back correctly would hear about it. She had 3 years left before she could retire, and she was visibly counting them. Fenna showed her the DoD Evaluation Authority letter and explained what she was looking for. Mendek looked at the letter, looked at Fenna, and said, "Pre-digital records are in cabinet row 4. Nobody's touched them in years. I can't let you take anything out of the room." "I don't need to take anything," Fenna said. "I need to read." Mendek unlocked cabinet row 4 and went back to her desk. The cabinets were 4 drawers tall and 8 wide. Session logs were filed by date and then by dog number. Fenna pulled a stool from the corner and started at the oldest drawer. She worked for 2.5 hours. The room was cold and the light was fluorescent, and her back started hurting after the first 45 minutes. And she kept going because somewhere in these files was the thread she needed. The 4-stage system had been developed and trialed before it had a name. If the trials had been conducted at Joint Bay, and the development notes in her bag suggested at least a portion of them had been, during a 12-week evaluation period she'd spent here under a different base commander. Then the session logs from that period would show the protocol in its earliest form. What they would also show was who designed it and who was present. She found the first relevant file in the 3rd cabinet, 4th drawer, buried under 6 months of maintenance logs from a training period 4 years prior to VLAN taking command. The handler name on the log was a corporal she didn't recognize, but the session structure, drive phase, arousal peak, controlled redirect, recovery window, repeat, was the 4-stage sequence in its trial form, annotated in the margins with handwritten notes about timing adjustments. The handwriting in the margins was hers. She sat very still for a moment, the file open on her knees, looking at her own handwriting from 6 years ago. She'd been here. She'd sat in this kennel building and run these sessions and written these notes and left them in the file because she'd been meticulous about documentation even then. Especially then. Because she'd known, even then, that the work was good enough to be worth stealing, and she'd wanted to leave a record. She hadn't known the record would end up in a supply room cabinet while someone else put their name on the certificate. She pulled out her phone and photographed every page. Then she went back through the cabinet and found 3 more files from the same trial period, all with the same marginal handwriting, all with her initials on the supervisor sign-off line. By the time she left the supply room, she had photographic documentation of 11 session logs from the original development trial. Each one predated VLAN's program presentation by more than a year. Each one showed the 4-stage methodology in its developmental form, annotated in her hand. She walked back to her office and sat down and thought for a few minutes about what came next. She had the documents in her field bag, the original handwritten development notes. She now had photographs of the trial session logs from the supply room. She had Brask's training records showing the Stage 4 removal and its consequences. What she didn't have yet was a clean chain connecting VLAN specifically to the removal of her name from the program's authorship. His name was on the certification documents. Her name wasn't, but certification documents could be explained as administrative paperwork. The argument would be that VLAN had led the formalization process, not necessarily that he'd invented the method. She needed something that showed deliberate removal, not just absence. She pulled up her laptop and opened the program archive folder that Greer's office had given her access to, the official document repository for the K9 unit. She started at the oldest files and worked forward. She found it in a folder labeled Program Development, Archive 2, that appeared to have been last accessed 14 months ago. It was a draft version of the training manual, time-stamped from the formal development period. The document had tracked changes still visible in the metadata, the version history that whoever had created the clean final copy had forgotten to strip. She clicked into the version history. The original author field, buried in the document properties of version 1.0, read F. Walgrave, Development Consultant. The author field in the final published version read T. VLAN, Program Director. Between those two versions, there were 17 track changes iterations. She didn't need to read all of them. She opened version 3, which was the first one where her name disappeared from the document header. The revision note for that change, entered manually by whoever had made the edit, read, Remove consultant credit per command decision. Formalize as unit development. Per command decision. Someone had made a deliberate choice to remove her name, and someone had been careful enough to write a justification into the revision history and careless enough to not delete it. She stared at the screen for a long moment. Then she copied the document, saved it to her encrypted field drive, and emailed it to her own backup server in Colburn with a timestamp request. She did the same with the photographs from the supply room. Then she sat back and rubbed her face with both hands, because she was tired and her back hurt, and she was furious in the specific managed way she'd learned to be furious over years of situations where being loud about it would only cost her. The anger wasn't new. What was new was having the evidence to do something with it. She was still sitting there when her phone buzzed with a text from a number she didn't recognize. Valan pulled Brask's euthanasia paperwork forward. Signed this morning, scheduled for 48 hours. She stared at the message. 48 hours. The same window as the colonel's inspection. She didn't respond to the message. She didn't need to. She knew who'd sent it. She picked up her evaluation folder and went to find Vanor. I was in the training yard running Argo through a corridor exercise, a tight quarters scenario where the dog had to navigate between two handlers without triggering, a recovery-dependent exercise that Argo was, predictably, not completing cleanly. He was resetting for the third time when Fenna walked up to the fence. I need 5 minutes, she said. Vanner handed the lead to the secondary handler and walked to the fence. He had the look of someone who'd been told something this morning that had put him in a worse mood than usual. Brask's euthanasia was moved up, she said. Commander's decision. The dog is not behaviorally unsound. He was failed by a training protocol that removed the stabilization phase. I have 14 months of session logs that show it. I don't make the call on, you signed off on his last 6 sessions, Fenna said. Your name is on the handler logs. If this goes to a formal investigation, those signatures matter. Vanner's jaw tightened. He looked at Argo, who was circling the far side of the training yard with the slightly frantic energy of an animal that needed to work but couldn't settle. What kind of investigation? He said. A DoD evaluation that results in a critical finding triggers an automatic program review, Fenna said. That review looks at all case files, including every dog that was removed from service or destroyed in the past 14 months, including who signed the handler logs. She let that sit. Brask is not dangerous, she said. He's dysregulated. There's a difference, and you know there's a difference. You've been in K9 long enough to know it. Vanner said nothing for a long moment. I was watching Argo run the fence line, and his expression had the complicated quality of a man who'd been telling himself a story about his own conduct, and was starting to notice the places where it didn't add up. The dog can't be saved in 48 hours, he said finally. Even if the euthanasia gets pushed, the program review. I'm not trying to save the dog in 48 hours, Fenna said. I'm trying to demonstrate what the dog is capable of with correct protocol applied. That's different. I need access to the main training yard, all available handlers, and the full K9 complement for a group evaluation session. He looked at her. All of them. All 18. All 18. That's never been done as a single evaluation session. If something goes wrong with that many dogs in drive state simultaneously, nothing will go wrong, she said, not if the protocol is applied correctly. He held her gaze for a moment. There was something shifting behind his eyes. Not quite belief, but the beginning of the recognition that he was going to be on one side of this or the other, and the math was changing on which side was safer. I'll need it approved, he said. I have evaluation authority. I'm approving it. She turned to go. 0800, the morning of the inspection. Make sure Brask is in the group. She walked away before he could argue. That afternoon, Greer found her in the kennel building working with Brask. Not formal evaluation, just supervised time in a small exercise run adjacent to his kennel, letting him move freely while she sat on an overturned bucket nearby and did paperwork. Greer stood at the gate with the expression of someone delivering a message she hadn't written and didn't endorse. "Commander Wieland would like to meet with you," Greer said. "His office, 1600. "I'll be there," Fenna said without looking up. Greer hesitated. "The euthanasia paperwork. I know about it. I want you to know I didn't route it. It went directly through the commander's office this morning." Fenna looked up at her then. Greer was a middle management administrator who had been put in a bad position by people with more authority and less conscience, and she had the look of someone who was very aware of that and not sure what to do about it. "Thank you," Fenna said. "That's useful to know." Greer nodded and left. Brask, who had been watching the gate, turned back to Fenna and walked over to sniff at the edge of her boot. She let him. He circled once and lay down 4 feet away, which was closer than he'd been to any human voluntarily in 2 weeks. She looked at him and thought about the 14 months of session logs and the 17 versions of a document that had her name until it didn't. She thought about the 3 dogs scheduled to be destroyed and the 17 that had been pulled from service and the facility full of handlers who were doing it wrong because the person who knew it right had been erased from the record. She had 40 hours. She went back to her paperwork. Wieland's office was on the 2nd floor of the operations building, with a window that looked over the K9 yard. He'd arranged it so anyone sitting across the desk from him could see the unit working below. It was a room designed to communicate authority. He was sitting behind the desk when she came in, which meant he'd gotten there first and set the table before she arrived. Small tactical thing. She noted it and sat down. "I hear you've been in the supply room," he said, "part of the evaluation process. The pre-digital records aren't part of the standard evaluation scope. They are when I determine they're relevant." She set her folder on her knee. "I want to discuss Brask's euthanasia timeline. That's a command decision within my authority. It's also a decision that will appear in my evaluation report, along with the session log showing the training failure that preceded the behavioral incident." She looked at him steadily. "I'd like to discuss whether that timeline is in the program's best interest given the inspection in 40 hours. He was quiet for a moment. He had good composure. She'd give him that. His face didn't move much, and what it did do was controlled. But she'd been watching people who were managing information for a long time, and there was a specific quality of stillness that wasn't calm. It was the stillness of someone calculating options. "The evaluation report," he said. "What's the preliminary finding?" "Systematic training failure resulting from removal of the Stage 4 integration protocol," she said, "with consequent behavioral deterioration across the high-drive K9 population, producing the 31% attrition rate. That's a methodology problem, not a personnel problem. The methodology was altered. That alteration has a decision point and a decision maker." He leaned back slightly. "You're talking about my program." "I'm talking about a program," she said, "whose original design documentation predates your command of this unit." There it was. She'd put it in the room now. He was very still. "What documentation?" "Development trial logs from the original 12-week evaluation, session records with supervisor sign-offs, and a document version history showing editorial changes to the authorship of the training manual." She kept her voice level. "The original author field reads differently than the published version." The composure held, but something behind it shifted. She watched him decide how much to acknowledge and how much to deny, which itself told her a great deal about what he already knew. "Documentation discrepancies happen in complex development processes," he said. "Administrative errors. The revision note reads, 'Remove consultant credit per command decision,'" she said. "That's not an administrative error. That's a record of an intentional change." The office was very quiet. "I want Brask's euthanasia postponed pending the group evaluation session tomorrow morning," she said. "If you postpone it, I'll present my findings through the standard evaluation report process. If you don't, I take the documentation to the colonel directly at the inspection." She watched him understand what she was offering and what she was threatening simultaneously. "You'd be making a significant accusation," he said. "I'm aware. With significant professional consequences." "I'm aware of that too." He looked at her across the desk for a long moment. The window behind him showed the K9 yard below where 3 handlers were running evening maintenance drills, dogs working in the long shadows of late afternoon. "The euthanasia can be reviewed pending evaluation findings," he said finally. "Standard protocol allows for a review window." "Thank you." She stood. I'll need all 18 dogs available for the group session at 0800. She walked out before he could change his mind. In the hallway, she let out one slow breath and kept moving. The negotiation had gone the way she needed it to go, but she didn't mistake that for a victory. Vaillant had agreed to a delay, not a resolution. He would spend tonight deciding what he could reframe, what documentation he could access and alter, and how to present the group evaluation session in a way that kept his name on the program regardless of what happened in the yard. She had one morning, 18 dogs, and a colonel arriving to watch. It had to be enough. She stopped at Brask's kennel on the way out of the building. The lights had dropped to evening level, and the kennel row was quieter now, the dogs settling from the afternoon energy into something closer to rest. Brask was lying near the front of his kennel, and when she stopped at the fence, he raised his head and looked at her. "Tomorrow," she said. He put his head back down but didn't look away. She left the building and walked across the dark yard to her temporary office, where she spent the next 3 hours writing the preliminary draft of her evaluation report. Every session log referenced, every document version time-stamped, every decision and its consequence traced back to the point where a working dog had been failed by a man who hadn't built what he was claiming to protect. She was finishing the third section when her laptop screen flickered, went black, and rebooted. When it came back up, the evaluation folder was open. The preliminary report was there, but the document properties showed a last modified time of 11 minutes ago. 11 minutes ago, when she'd been writing continuously and hadn't saved anything new. She checked the version history. Someone had accessed the document remotely. The last external access timestamp was 9 minutes ago, from an IP address inside the base network. They'd read the report, and they'd tried to see what she had. She plugged her encrypted field drive into the laptop and moved every file off the local drive and onto the encrypted backup. Then she disconnected the field drive and put it in her jacket pocket. Then she reopened the laptop document, deleted the actual report content, and replaced it with a version that contained accurate methodology findings, but omitted the authorship documentation entirely. Let them read that version. Let them think they'd seen what she had. The real report was in her pocket. She shut the laptop and sat in the dark room for a moment, listening to the bass settle into night. The distant sound of vehicles, the occasional bark from the kennel building, the hum of the operations center running its overnight systems. Somewhere across the base, a car door closed and an engine started. She wasn't surprised they'd escalated. She was mildly surprised it had taken until 9 o'clock. She locked the office, walked to her truck in Visitor Lot C, and drove off base to the motel in Caldero, where she'd been staying. She set her alarm for 5 in the morning, put the encrypted field drive under the mattress because it was the most boring hiding place and therefore often the most effective, and lay on top of the covers in her clothes for a while, staring at the ceiling. She was thinking about Brask, about a dog that had been failed so systematically that his own body had become unpredictable to him, who couldn't regulate because no one had ever taught him how, who was scheduled to die in the morning for learning exactly what he'd been taught. She was thinking about 18 dogs in a yard, and a colonel's eyes on all of it, and whether what she knew about these animals would be enough to be undeniable in the 45 minutes she'd have before the politics reasserted themselves. She was almost asleep when her phone rang. Unknown number. She answered it anyway. The voice on the other end was Wickersgill's, flatter than usual. "Vaillant called a handler meeting tonight," he said, off record. "He's telling the unit that the group evaluation tomorrow is a setup, that you're planning to induce a behavioral incident to create negative documentation and manufacture grounds for a program shutdown." She was quiet for a moment. "He's telling them," Wickersgill continued, "that they need to be ready to pull their dogs if anything looks wrong, that the dog's welfare is their responsibility, not yours." She understood what that meant. Vaillant couldn't stop the evaluation. She had the authority, and he'd already agreed to it. So instead he was going to poison it from the inside. He was going to have handlers primed to interrupt, primed to see whatever she did with 18 dogs as a threat rather than a demonstration. If even 3 or 4 handlers pulled their dogs during the session, the evaluation would fall apart. The colonel would see chaos and an incomplete assessment, and Vaillant would stand at the colonel's elbow and explain that the civilian evaluator's methodology had caused exactly the kind of behavioral instability she'd been claiming to prevent. It was smart. She had to give him that. "How many handlers were at the meeting?" she asked. Seven, Wickersgill said. I wasn't invited. I found out from Prout. Were you not invited because he knew you'd tell me? Wickersgill was quiet for a beat. Probably. Okay, she said. That's all you've got? Okay. I needed to know what the room looked like, she said. Now I know. Thank you. She hung up and lay in the dark and thought about 18 dogs and 7 handlers who'd been told she was the problem. She thought about Argo sitting down when she said 2 words, and Brask lying near the front of his kennel instead of pressed against the back wall. The dogs had already told her what they knew. Tomorrow she needed the humans in that yard to hear it too, before Valand could finish translating it into something that served his story instead of theirs. She closed her eyes. 5 hours until the alarm. She needed to sleep. She was most of the way there when another thought surfaced, the kind that arrives when the conscious mind has stopped arguing with it. The handler meeting had been off record. 7 handlers. Valand confident enough in his authority to tell them to pull their dogs from a federal evaluation. He was confident because he thought he'd seen her report, because he thought he knew exactly what she had. He didn't know about the supply room files. I didn't know about the version history and the document properties. He didn't know about the handwritten notes in the field bag she'd been carrying for 3 years. And now, because someone had accessed her laptop tonight, he would go into tomorrow believing he'd already neutralized her. She'd built a trap without meaning to. She'd built it by keeping her real evidence somewhere he couldn't reach, and now he was walking into the yard tomorrow with 7 handlers primed and a plan that depended entirely on a threat assessment he'd built from incomplete information. The colonel arrived at 1000 hours. Her session was at 8. She had 2 hours in that yard before the inspection, and a commander who thought he'd already won. She let herself sleep. She was in the yard at 5:45 while the base was still running on skeleton crew and the kennel building smelled like overnight cedar and dog breath and the particular stillness that comes before a place wakes up. She didn't go to the office first. She went straight to the kennels and walked the row slowly, checking each dog the way she'd been doing every morning. Not with a clipboard, not with formal assessment language, just reading the room. Who was tight, who was okay, who had spent the night circling. Most of them were tighter than the day before. Dogs read human tension the way some people read weather, and the facility had been running hot since her arrival. 7 handlers had gone to a meeting last night and come back with a story about her that wasn't true. And the dogs didn't know the story, but they knew the tension had changed shape. She stopped at Brask's kennel. He was standing, not pacing, standing, weight distributed, watching the corridor. When she stopped at the fence, he turned his head toward her with the particular quality of attention he'd started offering over the last 2 days. Not trusting, not afraid, just present. "It's a big day," she said quietly. He blinked. His tail moved once, low and brief. She moved on. At the end of the row, she stopped and stood for a moment with her hand on the last kennel post, running through what she knew. 18 dogs. The session was 2 hours and 15 minutes away. She had 7 handlers who'd been prepped to see her as a threat. She had Wickersgill, who hadn't been at the meeting. She had the encrypted field drive in her jacket pocket and the handwritten notes in her field bag, which she'd brought into the kennel building and locked in the evaluation office overnight because she didn't trust the motel room once she'd had time to think about it. She had a plan that depended on the dogs being exactly what they already were. That part she wasn't worried about. It was the humans that were the variable. She went to the break room and made bad coffee and drank half of it standing at the window watching the yard go from dark gray to pale gray as the light came up. A maintenance truck moved across the far end of the base. A pair of runners went past on the perimeter road. The base was waking up around a situation most of it didn't know was happening. At 6:30, Wickersgill appeared in the break room doorway. He poured himself coffee without speaking. She waited. "Velen's already in his office," he said. "Been there since 0600. Good." "That's good?" "He's nervous," she said. "Nervous people make choices that confirm what they're nervous about." Wickersgill looked at her over his cup. 3 of the handlers from last night are Darrow, Spice, and Cullum. They're the ones most likely to pull their dogs if they think they've got cover from command. She filed the names. "Who handles Brask normally?" "Brask's been on restricted status. He hasn't had a regular handler for 11 days. Vanner's been listed as primary of record." "Vanner was at the meeting?" Wickersgill paused. "He was in the room. I don't know if he was convinced." That was an interesting distinction, and she thought about it. Vanner had stood in the yard 2 days ago and watched Argo sit down, and he'd had the expression of someone whose certainty had cracked slightly. He'd agreed to pull Brask from training yesterday when she'd asked, before Wieland had moved the euthanasia paperwork. He was a man caught between institutional loyalty and something that was starting to look like evidence. He signs off on Brask's handler log for the session, she said. I need him to actually be Brask's handler. Not nominally, actually in the yard with the dog. Wickersgill was quiet for a moment. You want the man who signed off on failed training sessions to handle the dog he failed during the demonstration? Yes. That's either very smart or very risky. Both, she said. Can you make it happen? He drank his coffee. I can ask him. Can't guarantee the answer. Ask him early, she said, before Wieland gets to him again. Wickersgill set down his cup and left. She finished her coffee and went to the evaluation office to review her session plan. The group evaluation session was something she'd run twice before in her career. Once at a facility in Garrett during a program audit. Once at a private K9 academy in New Essen, where the lead trainer had requested a formal demonstration for his certification renewal. Both times had been controlled environments with cooperative handlers. Neither time had involved 18 dogs, a compromised chain of command, and an audience that included a federal inspector arriving in 90 minutes. The protocol was straightforward in principle and demanding in execution. She would bring all active K9s into the main yard simultaneously. Handlers would run them through a standard drive sequence, obstacle, pursuit, apprehension, to establish a baseline drive state. At the peak of the drive cycle, when the dogs were at maximum arousal, she would issue the Stage 4 recovery command. Not a handler-by-handler process, a single command, spoken once, to the whole group. If the recovery protocol had been correctly embedded, if the dogs had been properly trained through all 4 stages at any point in their career, they would respond. Not instantly, not perfectly, but measurably. Drive would drop. Aggression state would reduce. Dogs would orient toward handler rather than target. If the recovery protocol had not been embedded, if they'd been run through stages 1 through 3 only, as Brask had, as she suspected most of this unit had been for the past 18 months, they would continue in drive state, requiring individual handler intervention to control, and the yard would look exactly like what Wieland would want a colonel to see. Chaos caused by a civilian evaluator who didn't know what she was doing. The problem was this. She didn't know the full history of every dog in the unit. She had session logs for Brask and 3 others. She had general data on the population's drive scores and removal rates. But individual training histories for all 18 dogs would have taken days to pull, and she hadn't had days. What she had was Argo. Argo had responded to the recovery signal in the yard 48 hours ago with no preparation, no warm-up, no handler cooperation. He'd responded because the signal was embedded deep enough that it activated regardless of circumstance. That meant at least some of the training in this unit had been done correctly, or had been done correctly at some point in the past, before the Stage 4 removal. She was betting that some of the other dogs had the same deep embedding. Older training, pre-Wieland alteration. Dogs that had been in the program long enough to have received the full 4-stage sequence before the methodology was stripped. She was also betting that even the dogs who hadn't been fully trained would read the group response and regulate toward it. That was pack behavior. Not blind pack behavior, working dogs weren't wolves, but the social regulatory mechanism that made a K9 unit a unit rather than 18 individual animals. One dog coming down could pull the arousal level of the dogs around him. It was a sound theory. She'd seen it work. She'd also seen it fail when the environmental stress was too high, when handler interference disrupted the signal, when the target animal at the center of the group was too far gone to regulate. Brask was going to be in that yard. She sat with her session plan and thought about all the ways it could fall apart, because that was the only honest way to plan for anything. At 7:15, her phone buzzed. Text from Wickersgill. Vanner said yes. He'll handle Brask. No explanation. She put the phone down. She didn't know what had moved Vanner, didn't need to. The answer was in the yard in 2 hours. By 7:45, the yard was set. Handlers were bringing dogs out of the kennel building in pairs, leashing them to the staging posts along the south fence while the training area was cleared of obstacles and the perimeter secured. It was a brisk morning, enough chill to make the dogs lively, and the energy in the yard had the compressed quality of something that hadn't been released yet. Fenna stood at the center of the yard with her field bag at her feet and watched the handlers work. She could identify the 7 from last night's meeting by their body language, the way they positioned slightly away from her, the way they communicated with each other across the yard with looks rather than words. Darrow, Spice, and Cullum were grouped near the north fence with their dogs. All 3 handlers had their leash hands low, already in a control grip rather than a relaxed working hold. They were braced to pull. Vanner came out of this kennel building last, with Brask on a standard working lead. The dog was in the open air for the first time in 11 days, and his response was immediate. Head up, nostrils working, taking in 18 dogs in a yard full of handlers, and a morning that smelled like all of it at once. His weight shifted forward slightly. Not aggression, overwhelm. Vanner held the lead with both hands. He was watching Brask, not Fenna. Wickersgill stood near the equipment gate, arms crossed, watching everything. She waited until all 18 dogs were staged. Then she walked to the center of the yard and turned to face the handlers. "Thank you for being here," she said. Not warm, not aggressive, just matter of fact. Standard drive sequence to start. Obstacle, pursuit, apprehension. Handlers run your normal protocol. I'll observe and signal the transition. Nobody said anything. A few dogs barked at the energy of the group. Darrow's dog, a tall Dutch shepherd named Rack, was pulling steadily at the leash. When I give the transition signal, stop your training sequences and hold position. Don't intervene with your dogs unless there's a physical safety issue. Let the session run. Define physical safety issue, Spice said. He said it like a challenge, not a question. Dog initiating an uncontrolled bite on a person, she said. Everything else, hold position. Spice looked at Cullum. Cullum looked at his dog. She turned to the first handler pair and nodded. The session started. The drive sequence took 22 minutes. She watched it with the particular focused attention of someone reading a text in a language they knew well, tracking the arousal curve across the group, watching which dogs escalated quickly and which plateaued early, watching how handlers responded and which responses helped and which made things worse. She kept her face neutral and her posture still, which was its own kind of information for the dogs, who were reading her along with everything else. Brask ran the obstacle portion with the careful deliberateness of an animal working through unfamiliarity. He hadn't been in active training for nearly 2 weeks, and his body remembered the sequences even when his mind was occupied with processing everything around him. Vanner ran him quietly, less pressure than he used with Argo, and she noticed the adjustment, whether Vanner had made it consciously or not. At the 22-minute mark, drive state across the group was high. Dogs were barking, pulling, several in active apprehension drills with bite sleeves, the yard loud with the productive noise of animals operating at full intensity. She raised her right hand. The handlers stopped their sequences, some reluctantly. Darrow's hand tightened on Rack's leash. The yard shifted. Not quiet, not yet, but the quality of the noise changed. Dogs still in drive, handlers suddenly still, the energy compressed with nowhere to go. She had 3 seconds before someone interrupted. She pitched her voice at the level she'd used for 6 years of this work. Not a shout, not a whisper, but the specific resonance that carried without aggression, that moved through air without sounding like a threat. Easy. It wasn't the word that mattered. It was the signal structure embedded in the word, the tonal pattern, the breath timing, the physiological state of the speaker that working dogs read more accurately than most people read facial expressions. The Stage 4 recovery command wasn't a magic phrase. It was a complex multi-channel signal that she'd spent a year developing and 2 years testing, and it only worked if the speaker was in the right state to deliver it. She was. She had been since she woke up. Argo went down first. He was across the yard from her, leashed to a handler she didn't know well, but when the signal hit him, he stopped mid-bark and sat with the abruptness of a circuit cutting out. His handler stumbled slightly backward from the sudden absence of tension on the lead. 2 more dogs followed within seconds, both shepherds, both older unit animals, both dropping their drive state so fast their handlers stood confused with slack leashes. Then 3 more. Then 4. Darrow's Rack was still pulling. Cullum's dog had sat but was whining, fighting the regulation. 2 of the younger dogs hadn't responded at all, still barking, looking to their handlers for direction. But 10 of the 18 were down. Then 11, as one of the young dogs watched the dog next to him settle and seemed to make a decision about it. Brask was still standing. Vanner had both hands on the lead, and Brask was at the end of it, every muscle in his body lit up, taking in the group response with the desperate confusion of an animal who recognized the signal but couldn't find the off-ramp because nobody had ever built one for him. The Stage 4 work that should have given him this pathway had been skipped. He knew something was supposed to happen, he just didn't have the mechanism. He was shaking slightly. Not fear, overload. Too much activation, no discharge route, the system running at capacity with nowhere to go. Fenna walked toward him. Vanur looked up. His hands tightened on the lead. "Hold the lead," she said. "Don't pull it, just hold it." She stopped 4 feet from Brask. Not crouching. That was pressure from below, wrong geometry for this dog right now. Standing, turned slightly sideways so she wasn't squaring up at him. She brought her breathing down deliberately, the kind of conscious physiological regulation she could do in about 6 seconds because she'd practiced it for years. She said the signal again, quieter, closer, directly to him. Brask's shaking intensified for 1 second, the system fighting itself. And then something gave. His haunches dropped. Not a sit. He went all the way down, belly to the ground, head extended, like a dog that had been running for a very long time and had finally been told it was allowed to stop. He exhaled, long and unsteady, like a person crying without sound. The yard was completely quiet, 13 dogs down, 3 sitting, 2 still standing but no longer pulling. 18 animals in a yard that should have been chaos, and the loudest sound was the wind off the parade ground and Brask breathing. She became aware, slowly, that there were more people at the yard fence than there should have been. She turned. Colonel Adara Nevins had arrived 40 minutes early. She was standing at the main yard gate with 2 aides and Commander Veland, who had clearly not expected to be standing at a fence watching this. He was positioned slightly behind and to Nevins's left, and his face had the particular quality of someone who had walked into a room that had been rearranged since they last saw it. Nevins was a tall woman in her mid-50s with close-cropped gray hair and the contained attention of someone who processed what she was seeing before she responded to it. She was watching the yard. Not Fenna, specifically. The yard. 18 dogs. Their handlers. The specific quality of what had just happened. Fenna held her position near Brask. She didn't walk toward the fence. She didn't perform acknowledgement of the colonel's presence. She just stayed where she was, because the session wasn't over and the dogs needed her to stay where she was. After a moment, Nevin spoke. Not loudly, but she was used to being heard. "Is that the dog on the euthanasia order?" Silence. Veland said, "Colonel, if I can provide some context." "Is that the dog on the euthanasia order?" Nevin said again. It wasn't a question the second time. Vanner said, "Yes, ma'am." She was quiet for a moment, looking at Brask lying in the dirt of the training yard with his head extended and his breathing finally beginning to slow. "Who wrote the recovery command protocol?" she asked. Nobody answered. Fenna turned to face the fence. "I did," she said. Veland moved, not toward the fence, toward his radio. Fenna saw it, and Nevins saw it, and Nevins's aide took one quiet step that put him between Veland and the gate without appearing to do anything at all. "I'd like the evaluation documentation," Nevins said. "Everything." Fenna reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out the encrypted field drive. She also reached into her field bag and pulled out the folder she'd been carrying for 3 years. The 11 pages of handwritten development notes, dated, initialed, cross-referenced. She walked to the fence and held both of them out. Nevins took them. She looked at the folder first, opened it to the first page. Read for a moment. Turned to the second page. Her expression didn't change, but something behind it did. A kind of calcification, the look of someone whose assessment is being confirmed when they'd hoped it wasn't. She handed the folder to her aide without speaking. Then she looked at Veland. He was very still, on a floor that had just become uncertain. Not collapsed, not yet, but the kind of uncertain where every step required recalculation. "We'll conduct the formal review in the operations building," Nevins said. "I want the program director, the unit senior NCO, the evaluation contractor, and every document generated by this program in the last 24 months. She looked at the aide who had taken the folder. "Get the JAG officer on my staff up here from the vehicle." "Yes, ma'am." She looked at the yard one more time. At the dogs beginning to slowly, individually, return to working posture. At Brask still on the ground near Vanner's feet, no longer shaking. "Nobody touches that dog," she said, and walked toward the operations building. Wieland followed her. He had no choice. Fenna turned back to the yard. Her hands were steady. She hadn't realized they'd been unsteady until they stopped. Wickersgill was still at the equipment gate. He wasn't looking at the operations building. He was looking at her. She walked back to the center of the yard, and the handlers began moving their dogs to the staging posts. And the session was over, and the thing she'd spent 3 years waiting for was beginning in a room across the yard where a colonel was sitting down with documents that had her name on the back of them. It should have felt like relief. It felt like standing at the top of a climb and realizing the descent was still ahead. She crouched near Brask, who was still on the ground. Vanner hadn't moved him. She wasn't sure he knew whether he should. "He can stand," she said. "He's regulated. Let him up slowly." Vanner unclipped the long lead and attached a shorter one, then stepped back slightly and gave the dog room. Brask raised his head first, then his chest. He stood with the careful deliberateness of an animal testing new ground, looking around the yard at the other dogs moving back to their handlers. He looked at Fenna. She didn't speak, just held his gaze. After a moment, he walked to her side and stood there, pressed slightly against her leg. Not trained behavior, just a dog that had decided where he wanted to be. Vanner was watching. His expression was the complicated kind that had no name. Guilt, maybe, and something past it. "The session logs," he said. "The ones with my signature, on Brask." She waited. "I knew the recovery windows were short," he said. "I thought it was a protocol update. I thought Wieland had data that justified it." He stopped. "I didn't look hard enough at what was happening to the dog. It wasn't an apology. It was too honest to be an apology. It was a man saying out loud what he'd been avoiding for months." "I know," she said. "What happens now?" "Now there's a review," she said. "How that goes depends on what's in the room across the yard." He nodded. He looked at Brask. "He's a good dog." "He was always a good dog," she said. She stood and walked toward the operations building with Brask walking at her heel without a leash because nobody had told him not to and she hadn't told him no. She pushed through the door and into the corridor. Through the wall she could already hear the formal register of a military review beginning. Nevin's voice, careful and precise, and the sound of documents being moved across a table, and then silence. And then Nevin's voice again, asking a question that Fenna couldn't quite make out. She stopped in the corridor. From the operations room at the end of the hall came the unmistakable sound of a chair being pushed back hard, and then Wieland's voice, tighter than she'd heard it. Those documents were submitted under a formal development review process. "Commander," Nevin's flat and final. "I'm going to ask you to stop talking and let the JAG officer finish reading." Silence. Then the sound of papers turning. Fenna stood in the corridor with Brask at her side and waited, because the next thing that happened in that room was going to determine whether 3 years of careful, meticulous, exhausting documentation had been enough. And she had done everything she could, and it was out of her hands now, and that was the part nobody told you about when you set out to prove something that had been deliberately buried. It was never fully in your hands to begin with. The papers kept turning. Then the JAG officer's voice, careful and unhurried, said, "Colonel, I need you to look at page 7 of the version history." Nevin said nothing. A long pause. Then, "Get the program director's administrative access log from the base IT security office. Right now, tonight." The aide's footsteps moved quickly toward the door. Fenna pressed her back against the corridor wall. Brask sat down next to her feet and leaned against her leg, and she put her hand on the top of his head without thinking, and they both waited in the corridor while the sound of the review moved through the wall like something that had been building for a very long time and had finally, irrevocably, arrived. From inside the room, through the closed door, she heard the JAG officer ask Commander Tobin Wieland one more question. Quiet, precise. The kind of question that only gets asked when the answer is already known. "Commander, can you explain why your administrative credentials were used to access the evaluation contractor's laptop at 2114 last night?" The silence that followed the JAG officer's question had a texture to it. Not empty, but dense. The kind that fills a room when everyone present knows the answer and is waiting to see whether the person being asked will lie about it anyway. Wieland said nothing for 4 seconds. Fenna counted them from the corridor. Then, I was reviewing the evaluation documentation as part of my program oversight responsibility. The JAG officer's voice was unhurried. At 2114, using your administrative credentials to access a DoD evaluation contractor's encrypted work file. The file was on a base network device. The file was on a personal encrypted laptop connected to base Wi-Fi, the JAG officer said. The access was remote, through the base network, yes, but the device belongs to the contractor, and the access was not authorized by the contractor, and the file accessed was an active federal evaluation document. A pause. That's not oversight, Commander. That's interference with a federal evaluation process. Another silence. Fenna put her hand on Brask's head. He leaned into it. I'd like to speak with legal counsel, Veland said. That's your right, Nevins said. We'll pause the review until your counsel arrives. In the meantime, you're relieved of program authority pending the investigation. Major Hollick will assume interim command. She said it the way people say things that have already been decided. Not a judgment, just an administrative fact being stated aloud. The sound of a chair moving, footsteps. The door at the end of the corridor opened and Veland walked out. He saw Fenna. He stopped for exactly 1 second. His face did something complicated and brief. Not the controlled composure from his office, but something rawer. The face of a man who had just watched the floor he'd built become the floor he was standing on when it fell. He looked at her, and then he looked at Brask at her side, and then he looked away and walked down the corridor toward the stairwell without speaking. She watched him go. She felt nothing particular about it. Not satisfaction, not vindication, just the specific exhaustion of someone who had been carrying a heavy thing for a long time and had just set it down. And the muscles that had been braced for the weight didn't know yet what to do with the absence of it. The JAG officer appeared in the doorway. He was a compact man in his 40s with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and a legal pad covered in notes. Ms. Walgrave, he said, we're going to need your formal statement. Yes, she said. Can you come in? She looked down at Brask. He can come in, the JAG officer said after a moment. Under the circumstances. She walked down the corridor and into the operations room. The formal review took 4 hours and 40 minutes. It was not a dramatic process. It was methodical and procedural and occasionally tedious, which was the nature of the thing, dismantling a lie carefully enough that it couldn't be reconstructed. The JAG officer, whose name was Captain Rael Doss, worked through the documentation in the order that established the clearest chain. Original development records first, then the version history of the training manual, then the supply room session logs, then Brask's training file with the Stage 4 removal, then the 14 months of program attrition data. He asked Fenna questions in the flat, precise language of someone building a legal record, and she answered them the same way. Nevins sat at the head of the table and listened and occasionally asked her own questions, which were sharper and less procedural and cut directly to the parts of the story that the documentation implied but didn't state outright. When did you first attempt to raise the authorship issue through official channels? Nevins asked. 3 years ago, Fenna said. I submitted a formal credit dispute to the Military Working Dog Program Coordination Office. I received a form letter 11 days later stating that the program's development records were internally documented and no dispute process was available for post-publication credential corrections. Who signed the form letter? The coordination office sent it unsigned, standard boilerplate. Nevins looked at Doss. He wrote something on his pad. After that, I tried twice more through different channels. The second attempt reached a program liaison officer who told me verbally that pursuing the issue would likely affect my contract evaluation status. The third attempt was a written request to the base commander at Joint Bay, not Veland, his predecessor, which went unanswered. You kept documentation of all 3 attempts? Yes. The encrypted drive includes that documentation? Yes. Nevins was quiet for a moment. She had the quality of someone running calculations that went beyond the documents on the table. Program scope, institutional liability, how many hands had been on this before it reached her. It wasn't a comfortable set of calculations. Wickersgill was in the room for part of it, giving his own statement about the handler meeting and the Stage 4 removal and the flags he'd raised and the responses he'd received. He spoke with the careful economy of a man who had been in the military long enough to know that truthful statements were most effective when they contained no speculation. Just what he'd seen, what he'd said, what he'd been told in response. He didn't look at Fenna while he spoke. He looked at Doss's legal pad and gave him everything he needed. Banner came in near the end of the third hour. He'd asked to give a voluntary statement, which Doss had accepted. He sat across the table and talked about the session logs with his name on them and the shortened recovery windows and what he'd told himself about it at the time. He was not comfortable. He made no attempt to appear comfortable. He stated that he had raised a question about the recovery window reduction with VLAN 6 months ago and had been told the protocol had been updated based on new research and that he should run the sessions as designed. He stated that he had not pushed back further because he had assumed command had access to data. He didn't. In retrospect, he said, I should have pushed harder. A dog got hurt because I didn't. Doss wrote it down. Nevins looked at Vanner with an expression that was not warm, but was not unsympathetic. The kind of look that said, noted, and the consequences for that will be proportionate, and at least you're telling the truth about it now. Brask slept under the table through most of the review with his head on Fenna's foot, which was notable because he had not, to her knowledge, slept soundly in weeks. At 1400 hours, Doss called a brief recess. Fenna went to the break room and drank water and stood at the window looking at the yard, which was quiet now. The dogs back in kennels, the morning session already settling into the specific silence of a thing that had happened and couldn't be unhappened. Greer appeared beside her. She poured herself coffee and looked out the same window. Velen's counsel is on base, Greer said. He's been on his phone since the recess was called. Okay. Whatever counsel tells him to say, the version history is already in the record. The IT access log is already in the record. Greer paused. I want you to know I didn't know about the authorship. I knew the program had problems, but I didn't know what was underneath them. Fenna looked at her. I believe you, she said, because she did. Greer was an administrator who'd been handed a broken system and told to keep the paperwork clean. And she'd done that, which was its own kind of problem, but it was a different problem than Valan's. The euthanasia order, Greer said. I can formally rescind it this afternoon. It's within my administrative authority, and given the review status. Do it as soon as the recess ends, Fenna said, before anything else. Greer nodded. She left without finishing her coffee. Fenna stayed at the window for a few more minutes, alone. The yard was empty. The cedar stand at the far perimeter moved slightly in the wind. It was a plain, functional facility in a plain, flat part of a base that had been running the same operations for over a decade. And somewhere in the last few years, it had become a place where animals were being destroyed for learning what they'd been taught. She went back to the review room. The second half of the review was harder. Not procedurally. The documentary record was clean, and Doss was thorough. Harder because the picture that emerged from the evidence was larger than VLAN's individual conduct, and Nevins was intelligent enough to see it and irritated enough to say so. The Program Coordination Office received 3 formal disputes from the same contractor over 3 years and responded to all 3 in ways that foreclosed the process, she said at one point, not to Fenna specifically, but to the room. That's not one bad actor. That's a system that decided the dispute was inconvenient. Doss had no argument with that. Who was the liaison officer who made the verbal comment about contract evaluation status? Nevins asked. Fenna gave the name. She'd written it down 3 years ago and kept it in the same folder as everything else. Nevins wrote it on her own notepad. That name was going somewhere beyond this review. At 16:30, Doss closed his legal pad and summarized preliminary findings for the record. Documentary evidence supported the determination that the 4-stage drive and recovery training system attributed to Commander Veland's program development had originated with Fenna Walgrave during a 12-week evaluation period 6 years prior. Documentary evidence further supported that the authorship was deliberately removed from the published program documentation. The remote access to the evaluation contractor's laptop the previous evening constituted likely interference with a federal evaluation process and would be referred to the appropriate investigative authority. Regarding the K9 program, the removal of the Stage 4 integration protocol had directly caused behavioral deterioration across the unit population, resulting in the program's 31% attrition rate and the 3 euthanasia orders currently on record. All 3 euthanasia orders are suspended pending review, Nevins said. That's effective immediately. Administrator Greer is already executing the formal rescission on Brask. She looked at Fenna. The program's authorship documentation will be corrected. That process goes through the Military Working Dog Program Central Office, with my direct oversight, which means it will actually happen. She said the last part with the flatness of someone who'd just read 3 years of documentation about what happened when it went through channels without direct oversight. The training protocol will be restored to the full 4-stage system, Nevins continued. I want the corrected documentation distributed to every facility currently running the VLAN method. She paused. The VLAN method. We'll address the naming in the corrected documentation. What will it be called? Doss asked. Nevins looked at Fenna. Fenna hadn't thought about the name. She'd spent 3 years thinking about the documentation and the dogs and the process, and the name had been the part that felt most like vanity, which was maybe why it had been the easiest thing to lose. Whatever the program needs it to be called, she said. Nevins looked at her for a moment with an expression Fenna couldn't entirely read. Not disapproval, not admiration either. Something more complicated. The look of a person who understands that some people protect their work by keeping it functional rather than keeping it credited, and knows what that costs. We'll discuss that as part of the correction process, Nevins said, and moved on. The review formally closed at 17:15. VLAN's counsel had provided a written statement on his behalf, which Doss accepted for the record and did not read aloud. Whatever position it staked out, it was too late to stake it anywhere that mattered. The documents were already in the record, and the IT access log was already in the record, and 18 dogs had already sat down in a yard in front of a colonel who had arrived 40 minutes early because, as she mentioned privately to Doss afterward, she'd read Fenna's preliminary evaluation summary the morning before, and driven from Fort Alden that night to be here before the session rather than after it. Fenna learned that last part from Wickersgill, who learned it from Greer, who had overheard the colonel's aide on the phone. It meant Nevins had read what was in the preliminary report and driven 4 hours in the dark to see the yard session in person. It meant the preliminary report, the real one, the one in Fenna's pocket, not the cleaned version she'd left visible on her laptop, had been read by someone who understood what it was saying before VLAN thought the morning was won. She sat with that for a moment in her car in Visitor Lot C, not driving yet, just sitting. The sun was going down behind the operations building, and the base was transitioning into evening operations, and somewhere in the kennel building, Brask was back in his kennel with a rescinded euthanasia order and a different weight to the air around him, whether dogs felt such things or not. She thought about the 3 years of keeping the folder, the 4 hours of supply room filing cabinets, the 11 pages of handwritten notes, the encrypted field drive she'd carried in her jacket like a second spine. She thought about this version history in a document property field that someone had forgotten to clean, and how sometimes the evidence that breaks a thing open is the thing the person doing the covering was too confident to bother hiding. She started the truck and drove off base to Caldero and ate dinner at a diner that had been there long enough to have sticky menus and a coffee urn that ran all night. She sat at the counter and ate eggs and toast and stared at the wall and felt the specific disorienting flatness of someone who had been braced for a long time and had just been told it was okay to unbrace. It didn't feel like winning. It felt like being very tired in a way that sleep was going to help but not fix. Her phone buzzed twice while she ate. She looked at both messages. The first was from Doss. Formal statement to be signed tomorrow morning, 900 hours. Standard process. Nothing unexpected. The second was from a number she recognized as the Military Working Dog Program Coordination Office in Washington. She'd called that number 3 times and received form letters. It was a Saturday evening. The message read, "This is Director Harwell, MWDP. I've been briefed by Colonel Nevins. I'd like to schedule a call at your earliest availability. We have some things to discuss regarding the program correction and your continued involvement." She read it twice, put the phone face down on the counter, ate the rest of her toast. The coordination office that had sent her 3 form letters in 3 years was calling her on a Saturday evening because a colonel had briefed them, which meant Nevins had moved fast, which meant Nevins had anticipated that the program office would need to be handled before they had time to develop a position. Fenna was not naive about what that meant. The institution was going to correct itself because the institution had been caught, and the correction was going to happen in the way institutions corrected themselves, carefully, with attention to documentation and liability and the minimum amount of public acknowledgement that was consistent with the record that now existed. It was not justice in the pure sense. It was accountability in the practical sense, which was what was available and was more than she'd had yesterday. She picked up her phone and typed back, "Available Monday morning, 0800. She paid for her dinner and drove to the motel. She was back on base at 0700 the next morning before the formal statement process began, because she wanted to spend time with the dogs before the day got procedural again. The kennel building was different on a Sunday morning, fewer handlers, quieter rotation, a pace that was almost relaxed. She walked the row slowly. Most of the dogs were calmer than they'd been at any point since she arrived. Not because anything had structurally changed yet. The sessions hadn't been redesigned, the handlers hadn't been retrained. The program correction was a document in a review process that hadn't been published. But something in the building had shifted. Dogs were adaptive in ways that humans underestimated. They'd been in a high-tension environment for months, and they could feel that the tension had changed quality, even if they didn't know why. Brask was at the front of his kennel. He saw her come through the door and stood up, and when she stopped at his fence, he pressed his nose through the chain link. She touched the back of her hand to it. "You're going to be all right," she said. The same thing she'd said to Argo 3 days ago, which felt like 3 weeks ago. "I mean that differently now than I did then." She spent 40 minutes in the kennel building, moving slowly, letting the morning be quiet. When she came out, Vanor was in the yard doing early maintenance prep. He saw her, but didn't immediately come over. He finished what he was doing, coiled the line he was working with, and walked to where she was standing near the equipment gate. "My formal statement is at 1000, he said. "I know. I told Doss I'd waive legal review on the preliminary. Whatever the investigation determines about my conduct, I'm not contesting it." She looked at him. He looked like a man who hadn't slept much and had spent the hours he was awake doing a particular kind of accounting that didn't resolve easily. "The stage 4 removal," he said. "I knew the windows were wrong. I didn't say it loud enough." "No," she said. "You didn't." He nodded, like the agreement was what he needed, not forgiveness. "What happens to the handlers from the meeting? Darrow, Spice, Cullum?" "That's above my authority," she said. "I can only say what the evaluation found. The investigation determines conduct." "They were following a commander's direction." "So were you," she said. "There's a line between following direction and suppressing a dog's welfare because your commander told you the protocol was updated. Darrow and Spice ran Brask in 2 of his last 4 sessions. They saw the dog's state." Vanner was quiet. "They're not bad handlers," she said. "They made choices that hurt a dog, and those choices are going to be examined, and that's correct. That's what should happen." She paused. "So is what happens to you. So is what happens to Valand. The consequences aren't the same because the decisions weren't the same." He looked at the yard. The morning was warming up slightly, the cold front from 2 days ago beginning to break, and the light on the training ground had that clear, slightly overexposed quality that came after weather passed. "After the investigation," he said, "the retraining program, is there room for someone who got it wrong to learn to do it right?" She thought about that honestly. It would have been easy to say yes, reflexively, because that was what people wanted to hear, and it would have been easy to say no, because he had signed off on sessions that put a dog in a state that got the dog nearly killed. Neither answer was the true answer. "Depends what you do with what you know now," she said, "not what you did before." He nodded again. He went back to the maintenance prep. The formal statement process with Doss ran from 9 to 11:30 and was exactly as procedural and thorough as the review had been. Ben assigned 4 copies and initialed 12 pages and answered follow-up questions about the supply room logs and the version history access and the document retention history of her development notes. Doss was meticulous in a way she appreciated. Meticulous was how things held up. At 11:45, Nevins appeared in the doorway of the statement room. "A minute," she said. Fenna followed her into the corridor. Nevins spoke quietly, not because the hallway required it, but because she was the kind of person who reserved volume for rooms that needed it. "The program correction is being drafted. MWDP Coordination Office is going to reach out to you about the formal authorship restoration process. I want you to engage with that directly. I got a message from Director Harwell last night." "Good." A pause. "The corrected documentation will restore your name as the originating developer of the 4-stage system. The name of the system itself will be determined through the correction process, but I've made a recommendation." "What did you recommend?" "The Walgrave Protocol," Nevin said. "Not with ceremony, just stating the fact." Fenna was quiet for a moment. She'd told herself for 3 years that the name didn't matter, that the work was the point, that the dogs were the point. She believed that. It was also true that hearing her own name said plainly, officially, in that context, in a corridor of the facility where she'd spent 6 years being not credited for something she'd built, produced a feeling she hadn't anticipated and couldn't quite name. "Thank you," she said. Nevins looked at her with the measured assessment that seemed to be her default expression. "What you did in the yard yesterday morning, running 18 dogs in a simultaneous recovery demonstration in front of handlers who'd been primed to sabotage it. It needed to be undeniable," Fenna said. "It was." Nevins paused. "You took a significant risk. If it had gone wrong, I knew it wasn't going to go wrong," Fenna said. "The dogs were never the problem. The dogs knew exactly what they were doing." Nevins was quiet for a moment. "Your dogs knew the truth before we did," she said, and it sounded like something she might say again at some point in a different context. She walked back toward the operations room. Fenna stood in the corridor for a moment and then walked in the other direction, toward the kennel building, because the formal parts of the day were done and she needed to see Brask. She found Wickersgill in the kennel building hallway, which was not unusual. What was unusual was who was with him, a handler she recognized as Prout, the administrative specialist who'd sent her the archive delay email 3 days ago, now standing with a file folder and an expression of someone who had come to deliver something they weren't sure how to hand over. "Miss Walgrave," Prout said, "I found something this morning in the commander's administrative files. I was doing the interim handover for Major Hollick and I found—" She held out the folder. "I think you should see this." Fenna took it. Inside was a printed email chain. The header showed it was from 14 months ago. The sender was Valand. The recipient was the Program Coordination Office in Washington, the same office that had sent Fenna 3 form letters. She read it. It was a brief exchange, 4 emails, all businesslike, all using the language of program administration. VLAN notifying the Coordination Office that a contract dispute had been received regarding program development authorship. The Coordination Office asking for his recommendation on handling. VLAN recommending that the dispute be closed through standard boilerplate response on the grounds that the development records were internally documented and the contractor's claims were unsubstantiated. The Coordination Office confirming they would handle it accordingly. The dispute they were referring to was her first attempt, 3 years ago. The Coordination Office hadn't sent her a form letter because they'd assessed her claim and found it unsupported. They'd sent her a form letter because the program director had asked them to close it without review, and they'd done it. The 2 attempts after that would have been routed through the same office that had already taken direction from VLAN on exactly this topic. She stood in the corridor and read the email chain twice. The form letters had not been institutional indifference. They had been institutional cooperation, small, bureaucratic, easy to miss from the outside, but deliberate. Veland had not just stolen her work and put his name on it. He had actively managed the process by which anyone raising the question would be shut down before the question was examined. She was still standing there when Wickersgill said quietly, "You okay?" "Yes," she said, and then, "No, but yes." She closed the folder. "This goes to DOS immediately." "I figured," Prout said. She looked relieved that someone had taken it from her hands. "The statements are already signed," Wickersgill said. "They'll need a supplemental," Fenna said. "This changes the scope. The Coordination Office isn't an independent actor in this. They were receiving direction from Valand on how to handle my disputes. That's not one commander protecting his program. That's a chain." She looked at the folder in her hand. 3 years of form letters. 3 years of thinking the system had simply failed to function. It had functioned exactly as directed. She walked toward the statement room. Doss was packing his legal pad when she came in. He looked at her face, then at the folder, and set the legal pad back on the table. "Supplemental?" he said. "Yes," she said, and handed him the emails. He read them. His expression didn't change, but his pen came out. "This is going to extend the investigation scope significantly," he said. "I know. The Coordination Office is going to need to provide their own records. That's a separate process, different authority level." "I understand," she said. "But it's in the record now. It has to go where it goes." He looked at her with the appraising look of someone who had spent a career deciding whether people understood the weight of what they were initiating. "This isn't just about your program credit anymore." "It never was," she said. There are 17 dogs that were removed from service and 3 that were scheduled to die. Some of those decisions got made by handlers following a broken methodology, and some of them got made by a process that was being managed to protect one man's name. She held his gaze. The dogs are the evidence, Captain, but the dogs aren't the only victims. Doss opened his legal pad to a fresh page. From the beginning, he said. Tell me about the coordination office contact. She sat down and started talking. Outside the window, the K9 yard was quiet in the afternoon light. In the kennel building 60 yards away, Brask was in his kennel with his euthanasia order rescinded and his training record stamped for review, and the name on the program that had failed him was about to be pulled out at the root in a way that went deeper than anyone in that facility had understood this morning. The supplemental statement took 2 more hours. When she walked out of the operations building at 1650, the investigation had a new scope, a new set of questions, and a document trail that now ran from Joint Base San Antonio to a program coordination office in Washington that was going to have a very different kind of Monday morning than Director Harwell had anticipated when he sent her that message the night before. She stood in the parking lot and called the number back. It rang twice before Harwell picked up. Ms. Walgrave, he said, with the careful warmth of someone who had been told to be accommodating. I'm glad you called. I wanted to discuss the correction process and what your involvement. I want to discuss the email chain from 14 months ago, she said. The one where Commander Veland asked your office to close my dispute without review, and your office agreed. A silence. I'm not sure what email you're It's already in Captain Doss's supplemental record, she said. It will be part of the formal investigation documentation by tomorrow morning. I'm calling you now as a courtesy, so that whatever your office needs to prepare, you have the evening to prepare it. The silence on the other end of the line had the specific quality of a person recalculating everything they thought the week was going to look like. I think, Harwell said slowly, that we should speak in person. Monday morning, she said. 800. You can come to Joint Bay, or I can come to Washington. Your choice. She didn't wait for an answer. She ended the call and stood in the parking lot with the phone in her hand while the evening settled over the base and the lights came on in the operations building, and somewhere in the kennel building a dog barked once and went quiet. The investigation had just grown into something she hadn't fully anticipated when she drove here 4 days ago. She'd come to evaluate a failing K9 program and restore authorship of a training system. What she'd found instead was a managed suppression that had been running for 3 years and touching more than one office, and costing more than her name on a document. She was tired, her back hurt, her truck needed an oil change that was 600 miles overdue, and she had emails from 2 government offices and a JAG captain waiting for her attention, and a Monday morning call that was either going to be an institutional reckoning or an institutional negotiation dressed to look like one. She got in the truck. She drove to the kennel building because she wasn't ready to leave the base yet. Brask was at the front of his kennel when she came in. He was always at the front of his kennel now. It had been 4 days, and something in him had stopped waiting to be forgotten. She sat on the floor outside his kennel with her back against the wall and her knees up. He came to the fence and lay down on his side, pressed against the chain link, as close to her as the fence allowed. She sat there for a long time without saying anything. She thought about Monday morning, about Washington and document trails, and an investigation that was going to move in directions she couldn't fully predict and couldn't fully control, because the truth had a way of pulling at threads that led somewhere other than where you expected. She thought about what Nevins had said. Your dogs knew the truth before we did. 18 dogs in a yard, the simplest demonstration of all. The thing that couldn't be argued against or reframed or buried in a revision history because it had happened in front of everyone and it had no author field that could be edited afterward. She looked at Brask through the chain link. He looked back at her with his steady, dark eyes, and she thought about the word that had been used on his paperwork, dangerous, and how far from the truth it was, and how many decisions had been made on the basis of that word by people who hadn't been willing to look at what was underneath it. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. A message from Doss, sent 2 minutes ago. Veland's counsel has submitted a formal response to the IT access allegation. He's claiming the laptop access was authorized under a base security protocol that covers all devices on the network during active federal reviews. I've pulled the protocol document. Miss Walgrave, the protocol he's citing. It was added to the base network policy documentation 6 weeks ago. I need you to confirm. When did you first connect your laptop to the base network? She stared at the message. 6 weeks ago. The policy had been added 6 weeks ago. She'd connected her laptop to the base network for the first time 4 days ago, the morning she arrived. Valen's counsel was citing a policy that hadn't existed when she arrived. A policy that would need to have been drafted and submitted well before the evaluation was scheduled, before anyone could have known she was coming. Unless someone had known she was coming far enough in advance to quietly add a network access policy that would retroactively cover exactly what Veland had done to her laptop. She typed back, "I connected 4 days ago. First session morning. I can document the timestamp." Then she put the phone in her pocket and sat very still for a moment. The network policy had been added 6 weeks ago. She'd been assigned to the evaluation contract 8 weeks ago. There was a 2-week window in which someone had received word of her assignment and begun preparing, which meant either someone in the assignment process had told VLAN she was coming, or someone in VLAN's network had found out through other means, and either way, it meant the interference hadn't started the night her laptop was accessed. It had started before she arrived. She sat on the kennel floor for another 10 minutes after Doss's message arrived, not because she needed to think about what it meant. She understood immediately what it meant. But because the kennel floor was quiet and Brask was pressed against the fence beside her and she needed one more minute of quiet before the next thing started. The next thing was going to be significant. Someone in the assignment process had told VLAN she was coming. That was the only explanation that held. She'd been the third name on the evaluation list. The first two had declined. If either of those two had been in contact with anyone at Joint Bay, or if the assignment office itself had a leak, Veland would have known she was coming with enough lead time to quietly insert a network access policy into the base documentation that would give his counsel a retroactive legal argument for the laptop access. It was careful. It was the kind of careful that came from someone who'd been managing institutional risk for a long time and was good at it. What it wasn't was invisible. Because network policy additions had timestamps and authorization signatures, and Doss was already holding the document. She typed one more message to Doss. Pull the authorization signature on the network policy addition. Who submitted it and who approved it. Then she put the phone away and looked at Brask. "I have to go make some phone calls," she said. He blinked. She stood up, brushed the kennel floor dust off her jeans, and walked out of the building into the evening. The next 72 hours did not feel like victory. They felt like the sustained, unglamorous work of pulling a structure apart carefully enough to understand how it had been built. Doss pulled the network policy authorization signature by Monday morning. The document had been submitted by a base administrative officer named Colshaw, who had no apparent connection to Valand, which was the first sign that there was more distance in the chain than Fenna had initially assumed. Colshaw, when interviewed, stated that he'd received the policy language via a base administrative memo and had processed it as routine. The memo traced back to the base operations office. The base operations office traced back to a request submitted under the program director's administrative credentials. VLAN's credentials. 6 weeks before Fenna arrived. But the policy language itself, the specific legal framing of the network access provision, was not standard military administrative language. Doss flagged it to the base legal office, who recognized the phrasing as consistent with documents drafted by civilian legal consultants who specialized in DoD contractor relations. Someone had paid a civilian attorney to draft network access language and routed it through VLAN's administrative account to be inserted into the base documentation before a federal evaluator arrived. That was not a commander protecting his program. That was preparation. The kind of preparation that required time, legal consultation, and institutional access that extended beyond Joint Bay. The Washington question got louder. Harwell flew to Joint Bay on Tuesday. He arrived with 2 attorneys and the particular demeanor of a senior government official who had spent the weekend being briefed by his own legal team and had arrived at the conclusion that cooperation was the least damaging available option. He was a tall man in his early 60s with the practiced pleasantness of someone who had been navigating institutional politics since before Fenna was in uniform. And he sat across from Doss and Nevins in the operations room and answered questions with the careful precision of a man who was deciding in real time which answers were most useful to him. Fenna was not in that meeting. She didn't need to be. She'd given Doss everything she had. Her job in that room was already done. What she did instead was spend the morning with the K9 unit's training program, working with Major Hollick, Valand's interim replacement, a steady, unflashy officer who had taken command of the situation with the pragmatic focus of someone more interested in fixing a problem than assigning blame, to begin mapping what a restored four-stage curriculum would look like for each dog currently in the unit. It was the most useful thing she could do. The investigation was going to run its course. The institutional machinery was in motion. But while all of that ground forward, 17 dogs had been removed from service and needed a path back, and 3 dogs that had been scheduled for destruction needed to demonstrate what they were actually capable of, and none of that happened in a review room. She started with the dogs who'd been longest off service, 5 animals who'd been flagged as unreliable in the early months of the attrition spike, when the Stage 4 removal was still new and the program hadn't yet produced the crisis numbers that triggered the evaluation request. 3 of them were being held at a secondary kennel facility on the base periphery. She drove out there Monday afternoon with a handler named Solek, who was one of the unit members who hadn't been at VLAN's meeting and who had, according to Wickersgill, been quietly requesting evaluation of the removed dogs through proper channels for 6 months without getting anywhere. The 3 dogs at the secondary facility were in worse shape than the main unit. Not dangerous. She'd stopped applying that word to any dog in this program until she'd assessed them individually, but deeply habituated to uncertainty. Animals that had been pulled from active service and kenneled without meaningful work or social contact for months, because nobody had authorized their rehabilitation and nobody had authorized their return, and they'd fallen through the gap between those 2 decisions. She spent 3 hours with each of them over the course of 2 days. Not rushing. Doing the work the way it was supposed to be done, stage by stage, reading each dog's response and adjusting, building the trust backward from what it should have been at the start. The smallest of the 3, a 3-year-old Dutch Shepherd named Brecca, who had been flagged for biting a handler during an unsupervised kennel check, an incident the handler log didn't mention the handler had entered the kennel incorrectly, was the most shut down. She'd stopped seeking human contact entirely. When Fenna sat in her run on the first day, Brecca pressed herself into the far corner and shook. By the end of the second day, Brecca had crossed the run and sniffed Fenna's boot. That was all. But it was the beginning of the same thing she'd seen in Brask on her first morning at the main kennel, the first small choice towards something other than bracing. She documented every session and sent the notes to Hollick. On Wednesday, she drove to Washington. The MWDP Coordination Office occupied 2 floors of a federal building on the northwest side of the city, the kind of building that had been there long enough to feel permanent and anonymous at the same time. Harwell's office was on the upper floor with windows that faced a parking structure. He met her in a conference room rather than his office, which told her something about how he was managing the meeting. His 2 attorneys were there. Doss had sent a representative, a Lieutenant Garris, who sat quietly with a recording device and a pad, and spoke only to clarify procedural questions. Harwell opened with what Fenna recognized as a structured concession, a prepared acknowledgement of the Coordination Office's handling of her dispute submissions, framed in administrative language that accepted process failure while carefully avoiding the word deliberate. She listened to it without expression. When he finished, she said, "The email chain shows you were advised by Commander VLAN that my dispute was unsubstantiated, and your office accepted that assessment without independent review. The Coordination Office relied on the Program Director's assessment of your office had a conflict of interest in relying on the Program Director's assessment of a dispute against the Program Director," she said. "That's not a process failure. That's an oversight failure." Harwell's left attorney started to speak. Harwell raised one hand slightly, and the attorney stopped. "We agree," Harwell said, "that the dispute handling was inadequate." "I want the word deliberate in the formal record," she said. "Your office received direction from VLAN to close my dispute and followed that direction. That's not inadequate process. That's a decision." A silence. Garris looked at his pad and wrote something. "The formal investigation record," Harwell said carefully, "will reflect the email correspondence as documented. The characterization of intent is a matter for the investigative finding." "Then I want the investigative finding to be thorough," she said. "I want every dispute submission that your office has received regarding this program. Any dispute from any contractor or service member pulled and reviewed. If my 3 submissions were handled this way, I'm not the only one." Harwell looked at her with the appraising stillness of a man deciding whether to be impressed or concerned. "That's a significant scope expansion." "Yes," she said. "It is." She didn't soften it. She'd spent 3 years being softened out of rooms. She sat in the chair in the conference room in the federal building in Washington and held Harwell's gaze and let the scope expansion sit on the table between them until he picked it up. He picked it up. "We'll conduct the review," he said. It wasn't everything. It was what she could get in one room on one Wednesday morning. The rest of it would happen in the investigative process, and the documentation and the institutional machinery that she had set in motion but couldn't personally direct. That was always how it worked. You put the evidence in front of the right people, and then the institution ground forward in its slow, imperfect way, and the outcome was never as clean as the version you'd imagined in the years when you were waiting for it. But it was real. That was the thing. It was real, and it was on the record, and it was going somewhere. It couldn't be stopped. She drove back to Joint Bay that evening. The formal findings were released 4 weeks later. Commander Tobin Wieland was relieved of command and referred to the Inspector General's office for investigation of misconduct, specifically the unauthorized alteration of program authorship documentation, the interference with a federal evaluation process, and the coordination with a civilian legal consultant to preemptively undermine an evaluator's work product. His military record was flagged pending the IG investigation, which had a broader scope than the internal review. Broader because Doss's supplemental findings had pulled the thread far enough to reveal that the network policy preparation was not the only preemptive action Wieland had taken. 2 months before Fenna arrived, he'd also communicated with the first evaluator on the assignment list, the one who had declined. The communication was not a threat. It was a carefully worded professional note raising questions about the evaluator's qualifications and the evaluation scope. Subtle enough that the evaluator might not have recognized it as pressure. Effective enough that the evaluator had declined. The second evaluator on the list had received a similar note. Fenna had been third on the list because she was the one Wieland hadn't figured out how to discourage in advance. He'd run out of names before he ran out of methods. That detail, when she read it in the formal findings, produced an emotion she hadn't anticipated, something between dark humor and a grim satisfaction that was hard to name. She'd been the last resort, the one he'd had to prepare for differently because he hadn't had time to push her away. And the reason he hadn't had time was because 2 other evaluators had already gone, and the assignment office had needed to move quickly, and in that speed he'd had to rely on the network policy and the laptop access instead of the subtler, earlier method. He'd run out of runway. And she'd arrived. Sergeant Reese Vanner received a formal reprimand and was removed from independent K9 training authority pending a retraining and review process. The finding noted his voluntary cooperation with the investigation and his waiver of legal review, which were factors in the disposition. He was not removed from the unit. He was required to complete the full 4-stage certification process under external oversight before he could resume handler duties. Whether he came out the other side of that as someone who could be trusted with these animals was something the process would determine. Fenna had no strong opinion about what happened to Vanner. She had the opinion that people who made mistakes with animals needed to understand specifically what they'd done and why, and what it cost. If the process produced that understanding, it was doing its job. Handlers Darrow, Spice, and Cullum received counseling records noting the interference attempt and were placed on performance review. All 3 had cooperated fully with the investigation once it was clear which way the wind was blowing. Fenna noted that cooperation and noted also that it had come after the outcome was clear, which was different from Vanner's cooperation, which had come when the outcome was still uncertain. She noted both facts and left the weighing of them to the people whose job it was to weigh such things. The Military Working Dog Program Coordination Office conducted the dispute review Fenna had requested. It found 4 other contractor submissions that had been handled similarly, closed on program director recommendation without independent review, across 2 different installations. 3 of the 4 contractors were no longer working in military K9 evaluation. The 4th had retired. The review produced a new dispute protocol requiring that all authorship or credit disputes be routed to an independent review board with no direct reporting relationship to the subject of the dispute. It was a structural change. Small in the scope of institutional reform, significant in the scope of what it prevented going forward. Harwell submitted his own office's process failure findings as part of his cooperation with the investigation. His name appeared in the formal record as a responsible official who had not acted with deliberate intent but had failed in his oversight duty. He was not removed from his position. He was required to implement the new dispute protocol and report on its implementation quarterly for 2 years. Fenna thought about that outcome for a while. She didn't arrive at clean feelings about it. Harwell had run an office that had served as an instrument for shutting down legitimate claims, and the consequence was bureaucratic reporting requirements. There was an argument that his cooperation had value, and that the structural reform was more important than the individual punishment. There was also an argument that the people who ran the rooms where injustice was laundered through administrative language rarely faced consequences proportionate to what they enabled. Both arguments were true. That was the thing about institutions. They rarely gave you clean outcomes to feel clean about. What mattered was what was now in place that hadn't been before. The formal authorship correction was published 6 weeks after the findings. The Military Working Dog Program issued a corrected program credit document that identified Fenna Walgrave as the originating developer of the 4-stage drive and recovery training system. The system was formally renamed the Walgrave Protocol, effective across all installations currently running the program, 14 facilities in 8 states. She received the corrected document by email on a Thursday morning. She was in the temporary office at Joint Bay, where she'd extended her evaluation contract at Hollick's request to oversee the curriculum restoration. She read the document once, the way you read something you've been waiting for long enough that the actual arrival of it is slightly surreal. Then she saved it to her encrypted field drive and put the phone in her pocket and went to the kennel building. Brask was in the main exercise yard. He'd been moved to the main facility 3 weeks ago when his formal review cleared him for behavioral rehabilitation. He was working with Vanner, not on the aggressive drive sequences that had broken him, but on the early stages of the restoration protocol. The patient, structured work that gave a dog's nervous system the chance to learn that down was a place it was allowed to go. She watched from the fence. Vanner was running him through a simple recall pattern: call, approach, reward, release, repeat. Brask was not the fluid, responsive animal he might have been if the last 14 months had gone differently. He had a hitch in his trust, a slight hesitation at the transition points where, in his experience, the handler had previously escalated instead of rewarding. It was going to take a long time to smooth out. Maybe it never completely would. He was working. He was present. He was making choices toward the handler rather than away from him. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything. Vanner looked up from the session and saw her at the fence. He said nothing. She said nothing. He went back to the session, and she watched for a few more minutes, and then walked around to the gate. She spent the rest of the morning doing what she'd been doing every day for 6 weeks, working through the population of dogs one by one, building the restoration of the protocol from the inside out. Some of them were coming back quickly. Some of them were going slowly. Brecca, the small Dutch shepherd from the secondary facility, had been moved to the main yard 2 weeks ago and was in early stage 2 work, cautious, measured, 2 steps forward and 1 step back, but forward. None of it was fast. None of it was clean. It was the same kind of work that everything worth doing was, repetitive and demanding and invisible to anyone who wasn't in the room watching the small increments accumulate into something real. At 1300 hours, Hollick found her in the kennel building. "There's a call for you," he said. "Washington, Director Harwell's office." She went to the temporary office and took the call. It was not Harwell. It was a woman named Pellick from the MWDP Program Development Division who introduced herself with the careful formality of someone delivering a message they'd been told was important. "We've been developing a proposal," Pellick said, "a formal K9 behavior specialist advisory position embedded within the MWDP structure. The role would involve curriculum oversight, facility review, and protocol development across the program's 14 installations." A pause. "We'd like you to consider it." Fenna was quiet for a moment. It was the role. The thing that made sense, the thing that would let her take what she'd done at Joint Bay and apply it everywhere the program ran, so that the systemic failure she'd found here couldn't quietly reproduce itself at another installation with a different name and the same dynamics. It was also an institutional role, which meant it came with institutional constraints, institutional politics, institutional inertia. She'd spent 6 years outside the institution by necessity, doing the work from the outside because she'd been pushed out. Going back inside was a different kind of existence. "What's the reporting structure?" she asked. Pellick explained. The position reported to the program development director, with independent oversight authority over protocol compliance. Disputes routed through the new independent review board, the one that had come out of the Washington findings. And the 14 facilities, Fenna said. All of them, not selected ones. All 14. If I find protocol violations, I have authority to flag them directly without going through installation command first? A brief pause. That's being written into the position description. I want it in writing before I agree. Of course, Pellick said. Fenna looked out the single small window of the temporary office at the K9 yard, where two handlers were running afternoon maintenance drills. The sun was low, and the shadows were long, and the dogs moved through the light with the purposeful energy of animals doing the work they were made for. I'll review the written position description, she said, and I have a condition. What condition? The position doesn't start until the restoration curriculum at Joint Bay is stable. I'm not leaving this unit until every dog that was damaged by the failed protocol has a clear path forward. A pause. We can accommodate that timeline. Then send me the description, she said, and ended the call. She sat in the office for a moment after the call ended. Not deliberating, she'd already decided, and she knew it, but sitting with the weight of what was happening because it deserved to be sat with. She'd driven here in a 9-year-old truck with a cracked dashboard and a folder in her field bag, and the specific stubbornness of someone who had been told 3 times through official channels that their claim didn't exist, and had not accepted any of those 3 times because the evidence existed, and the dogs existed, and the truth was still the truth, regardless of how many form letters had been sent to suggest otherwise. She hadn't come here with a plan to reshape the MWDP. She'd come to restore authorship and save a dog that was scheduled to die. The scope had expanded because the evidence required it to. That was how it usually worked, in her experience. You did the thing you came to do, and you found out the thing you came to do was actually a small part of something larger, and you had to decide whether to stop at the edge of what you'd originally intended or to follow the evidence. She had followed the evidence. The cost of that was 6 years of contract work and a cracked dashboard, and 3 form letters, and the specific fatigue of carrying something heavy for so long that you stopped noticing how much you were compensating for the weight. The return on it was 18 dogs in a yard, and Brask breathing for the first time in weeks, and a document with her name on it being distributed to 14 facilities, and a structural change in how dispute submissions were handled, and Brecca crossing a kennel run to sniff a boot. Not everything, not clean, but real. 3 months later, on a Tuesday morning, Brask completed his certification assessment. The assessment was run by Hollick, with 2 external evaluators from a facility in Greaves present as independent observers, because the unit's self-evaluation authority was still being restored, and Hollick had asked for external observers voluntarily, which Fenna had noted as a sign that he understood the assignment. She was not one of the assessors. She watched from the observation platform above the main yard, which gave her a view of the whole training area, the obstacles, the pursuit corridor, the recovery stations at the perimeter. Brask worked with Wickersgill. That had been Wickersgill's request, made quietly to Hollick 6 weeks before the assessment. He'd been in the unit longer than any other active handler. He'd flagged the stage for removal twice and been shut down. He'd sent Fenna the text message about the euthanasia order being moved forward. He'd cooperated with the investigation from the beginning, without being asked, because he'd been waiting for someone to take the evidence seriously and had been prepared to help the moment that person arrived. He wasn't a perfect handler. He was the kind of handler who had stayed in a broken system long enough to be partially shaped by it, which meant there were habits and patterns that would need to be relearned alongside the dogs he was retraining. He knew that. He'd said so to Fenna in one of the conversations they'd had over the past 3 months. The brief, honest exchanges that had accumulated into something she would call trust, carefully, because she didn't use the word carelessly. He ran Brask through the assessment with the patient deliberateness of a man who was not in a hurry and not performing. Drive sequence, obstacle course, controlled apprehension, recovery. The recovery was the part she watched most carefully. It was the part that mattered. Brask hit his drive peak in the pursuit corridor. She could see the activation from the platform, the body language that months ago had meant an animal running past its own off-ramp. And then Wickersgill gave the stage 4 signal. Brask came down. Not instantly. Not perfectly. He had a moment in the middle where she could see him fighting the residue of everything that had been done wrong, the months of no off-ramp, the broken trust, the history of activation with no resolution. He fought it for about 3 seconds, and then the training won, and he came down. He completed the rest of the assessment clean. When Hollick marked the final evaluation form and handed the external observers the completion sheets, Fenna came down from the observation platform and walked to the edge of the yard. Wickersgill saw her coming and walked Brask to the fence. The dog saw her from about 20 yards away, and his tail started moving. Not the brief, uncertain single movement from the early days of her arrival, but a full, sustained wag that looked slightly undignified on an 80-pound military working dog, and was, for that reason, exactly right. "He did well," she said. "He did," Wickersgill said. He was not a man who performed emotion, but there was something in his face that was not quite steady. He had to work for it. "The ones who have to work for it keep it longer," she said. She opened the gate and came into the yard. Brask didn't wait. He walked directly to her and pressed his head against her hand, which she'd never trained him to do, and which he had decided on his own was an acceptable behavior. She scratched behind his ear and he closed his eyes. "What happens to him now?" Wickersgill asked. "Active service roster," she said. "Same as any certified K9. She paused. "He's your dog, Del. If you want the assignment—" He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "I want the assignment." Fenna left Joint Bay 11 days later. She'd received the written position description from MWDP on a Friday, reviewed it with her own attorney over the weekend, a woman she'd used for contracts since her first evaluator position, who read the document carefully and said it was as good as she was going to get from a government position description, and probably better, and signed it on a Monday morning. She drove back to Colburn to close the temporary office in the converted machine shop. She loaded her field equipment into the truck, donated the shelter transport crate to the county rescue where she'd been picking up weekend shifts, and drove back through the freight rail yard and the scrub grass lots that surrounded the machine shop building one last time. She'd done 8 months of her best work in this building. She'd written the original development notes in a deployment barracks 6 years ago and refined them in 3 different offices since. She'd carried them in a field bag through every contract job and every official dismissal and every form letter because she'd known what she had and she'd refused to let the knowing expire. The machine shop was not a sentimental place. She didn't feel sentimental about it. She felt done with it, which was its own kind of clean. She drove to Joint Bay one more time before she started the new position. Not for any procedural reason. The formal transition was handled through the MWDP office. She drove back because she wanted to see the yard before it became the first of 14 rather than the only one. The yard was in afternoon session when she arrived. 6 dogs in active work, handlers running the restored curriculum, the full 4 stages visible in the session structure, the drive and the recovery both present, neither one sacrificed for the other. It looked like what it was supposed to look like, not perfect. Handlers making adjustments, dogs having moments of difficulty. The imperfect, alive quality of a system being relearned by people who were doing it in real time. It looked like work being done right. She watched from outside the fence for about 15 minutes. Hollick came out of the operations building and saw her there and walked over. "You're not supposed to be here until the Washington onboarding," he said. Not unfriendly, just noting it. "I know," she said. "I wanted to see it running." He stood beside her at the fence. They watched a young handler run a Malinois through the stage 3 sequence, drive peak, controlled redirect, and then come into the recovery window with the patience and timing that meant the handler had actually internalized what the stage was for rather than just mechanically following the steps. "How's the new description reading to the unit?" she asked. "Better than expected," Hollick said. "Most of them knew something was wrong. They just didn't have language for it." He paused. "Having the right name for it helps." She understood that. Having the right name for something was how you taught it, passed it on, kept it from being lost. It was why she'd written things down in the first place. A year ago, she wouldn't have thought of it that way. A year ago, she'd thought of the documentation as protection, evidence to fight with if she needed to fight. She still thought of it that way. But she also thought of it now as something that outlasted the fight, something that existed beyond the specific dispute and the specific injustice, and had a life that wasn't dependent on whether the person who created it got credit for it. The dogs had always known the method, regardless of whose name was on it. That was the part that had kept her going in the years when the documentation sat in a field bag and the form letters kept coming. The work was real, The work functioned. The dogs demonstrated the truth of it every time they came down from a drive peak because someone had built them a pathway out. That was not nothing. That was, in the long run, everything. Take care of them, she said to Hollick. That's the job, he said. She drove back to the highway and pointed the truck toward Washington. 6 months after she took the position, the MWDP published a revised training standards document for all 14 installations. The cover page listed the program's foundational methodology by its corrected name, the Walgrave Protocol, developed by K9 behavior specialist Fenna Walgrave, with a development date that predated VLAN's command by 14 months. VLAN's name did not appear anywhere in the document. His IG investigation concluded the following spring with a finding of misconduct on 3 counts: unauthorized alteration of official program documentation, interference with a federal evaluation process, and abuse of administrative authority in directing the Coordination Office's handling of contractor disputes. He was separated from service without retirement benefits. His counsel appealed the separation. The appeal was denied. Fenna read the appeal denial in a hotel room in Greaves, where she was conducting the second installation review of her new position. She read it the way you read news that you've already metabolized, not with the sharp feeling you expected, but with a quiet that was neither satisfaction nor relief, but something closer to the specific peace of watching a long account finally settle. She put the phone on the nightstand and went to sleep. In the morning, she drove to the Greaves installation and spent the day in the kennels. The dogs at Greaves had problems she was beginning to recognize as a pattern across installations. Not the same failure as Joint Bay, but adjacent to it, the kind of drift that happened when a program was copied without being fully understood. She wrote up her findings in the evaluation report and flagged 3 specific protocol deviations for corrective action. She did it without drama. She did it the way she did everything now. Methodically, documented, patient with the pace of institutional change. Because institutional change was slow, and patient was the only approach that actually worked. Brask retired from active service 2 years later, transferred to Wickersgill's care under the Military Working Dog Adoption Program. He was 6 years old and in good health and had spent 2 years on active duty without a single incident flag. Wickersgill sent her a photo on the day Brask came home. The dog standing in a yard, looking directly at the camera with the steady, dark eyes she recognized, with what appeared to be an indignant expression about having a photo taken. She kept the photo on her desk. Not prominently, just there. She thought sometimes about what it meant that a dog had been the clearest evidence in the whole chain of events. Not the documents. The documents were what made the case, gave it shape, gave it a timeline and a legal foundation. But the moment that had shifted everything, the moment that was undeniable because it had happened in front of a colonel and 18 handlers and could not be revised or reframed or buried in a version history, that moment had been 18 dogs in a yard coming down from drive state because someone had given them a way out. The dogs knew. Before the documents were found, before the version history was pulled, before the IT access log was time-stamped, the dogs knew what the method was and who it belonged to. They demonstrated it in the yard the way they'd always demonstrated it, without agenda, without politics, without the complicated human machinery of credit and institution and career. That was the thing she kept coming back to in the months and years after Joint Bay. Not the investigation, not the formal findings, not even the document with her name on it. The moment Brask went down. An animal that had been broken by a system that stripped away everything it needed to regulate itself, that had been labeled dangerous and scheduled for destruction, that had been failed at every stage by people who should have protected it. That animal, in that yard, on that morning, made one choice. It chose to come down when someone finally gave it the way out. She thought about that a lot. Not only about dogs. People spend enormous energy on the systems that define who gets credited and who gets erased, who gets the name on the document and who gets the form letter. Those systems are real, and they matter, and they're worth fighting. She'd spent 3 years fighting one, and she'd do it again. But underneath all of it, underneath the version histories and the email chains and the institutional machinery, there was always the simpler question of whether the work was real, whether what you built actually functioned, whether it held up under pressure, gave other things a pathway, worked for the people and animals it was designed to serve. Her work had functioned even when her name was removed from it. The dogs had always known. And in the end, that was the thing that couldn't be stolen. Not the documentation, which could be altered, and not the credit, which could be erased, but the work itself, embedded in the animals, visible the moment someone paid attention. You could lose your name, you could lose your position. You could spend years carrying evidence in a field bag, driving a truck with a cracked dashboard, being the third name on a list that two other people had already declined. What you couldn't lose if you'd built something true was the truth of what you'd built. That was the lesson the dogs had spent 14 months trying to teach a facility full of handlers who were too busy maintaining the fiction to hear it. Fenna Walgrave had heard it, and she had walked through a gate and into a yard and let 18 animals show the world what she'd always known. The woman they underestimated was never the outsider they decided she was. She was the one who had built the house they were all living in. And when they tried to lock her out, she didn't break down the door. She just walked to the yard, said 2 words, and let the truth demonstrate itself.